Chapter 38 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shushan. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 38. The Recognition. Far away, over sea and land, over sunny sea again, great guns were booming on that 7th of May, 1799. The Mediterranean came up with a long roar on a beach glittering white with snowy sand and the fragments of innumerable seashells, delicate and shining as porcelain. Looking at that shore from the sea, a long ridge of upland ground, beginning from an inland depth, stretched far away into the ocean on the right, till it ended in a great mountainous bluff, crowned with the white buildings of a convent, sloping rapidly down into the blue water at its base. In the clear eastern air, the different characters of the foliage that clothed the sides of that sea-washed mountain might be discerned from a long distance by the naked eye. The silver grey of the olive trees near its summit, the heavy green and bossy forms of the sycamores lower down, broken here and there by a solitary terebinth or ilex tree, of a deeper green and a wider spread, till the eye fell below on the maritime plain, edged with the white seaboard and the sandy hillocks, with here and there feathery palm trees, either isolated or in groups, motionless and distinct against the hot purple air. Look again. A little to the left on the seashore there are the white walls of a fortified town, glittering in sunlight, or black in shadow. The fortifications themselves run out into the sea, forming a port and a haven against the wild Levantine storms, and a lighthouse rises out of the waves to guide mariners into safety. Beyond this walled city, and far away to the left still, there is the same wide plain shut in by the distant rising ground, till the upland circuit comes closing in to the north, and the great white rocks meet the deep tideless ocean with its intensity of blue color. Above, the sky is literally purple with heat, and the pitiless light smites the gazer's weary eye as it comes back from the white shore. Nor does the plain country in that land offer the refuge and rest of our own soft green. The limestone rock underlies the vegetation, and gives a glittering ashen hue to all the bare patches, and even to the cultivated parts which are burnt up early in the year. In springtime alone does the country look rich and fruitful. Then the cornfields of the plain show their capability of bearing, some 50, some an 100-fold. Down by the brook Kishon, flowing not far from the base of the mountainous promontory to the south, there grow the broad green fig trees, cool and fresh to look upon. The orchards are full of glossy-leaved cherry trees. The tall amaryllis puts forth crimson and yellow glories in the fields, rivaling the pomp of King Solomon. The daisies and the hyacinths spread their myriad flowers. The anemones, scarlet as blood, run hither and thither over the ground like dazzling flames of fire. A spicy odor lingers in the heated air. It comes from the multitude of aromatic flowers that blossom in the early spring. Later on they will have withered and faded, and the corn will have been gathered, and the deep green of the eastern foliage will have assumed a kind of grey-bleached tint. Even now in May, the hot sparkle of the everlasting sea, the terribly clear outline of all objects, whether near or distant, the fierce sun right overhead, the dazzling air around, were inexpressibly wearying to the English eyes that kept their skilled watch, day and night, on the strongly fortified coast town that lay out a little to the northward of where the British ships were anchored. They had kept up a flanking fire for many days in aid of those besieged in Saint-Jean-de-Acre, and at intervals had listened, impatient, to the sound of the heavy siege guns, or the sharper rattle of the French musketry. In the morning, on the 7th of May, a man at the masthead of the Tigre sang out that he saw ships in the offing, and in reply to the signal that was hastily run up, he saw the distant vessels hoist friendly flags. That May morning was a busy time. The besieged Turks took heart of grace. The French outside, under the command of their great general, made hasty preparations for a more vigorous assault than all many, both vigorous and bloody, that had gone before, for the siege was now at its 51st day. In hopes of carrying the town by storm before the reinforcement coming by sea could arrive. And Sir Sidney Smith, aware of Bonaparte's desperate intention, ordered all the men, both sailors and marines, that could be spared from the necessity of keeping up a continual flanking fire from the ships upon the French, to land, and assist the Turks and the British forces already there in the defence of the old historic city. Lieutenant Kinraid, who had shared his captain's daring adventure off the coast of France 3 years before, who had been a prisoner with him and Wesley Wright in the Temple at Paris, and had escaped with them, and through Sir Sidney's earnest recommendation been promoted from being a warrant officer to the rank of lieutenant, received on this day the honour from his admiral of being appointed to an especial post of danger. His heart was like a war-horse, and said, "Ha, ha!" as the boat bounded over the waves that were to land him under the ancient machicolated walls where the Crusaders made their last stand in the Holy Land. Not that Kinraid knew or cared one jot about those gallant knights of old. All he knew was that the French, under Boney, were trying to take the town from the Turks, and that his admiral said they must not, and so they should not. He and his men landed on that sandy shore, and entered the town by the Waterport gate. He was singing to himself his own country song. "Will may the keel row," and his men, with sailors' aptitude for music, caught up the air, and joined in the burden with inarticulate sounds. So, with merry hearts, they threaded the narrow streets of Acre, hemmed in on either side by the white walls of Turkish houses, with small grated openings high up, above all chance of peeping intrusion. Here and there they met an ample-robed and turbaned Turk going along with as much haste as his stately self-possession would allow. But the majority of the male inhabitants were gathered together to defend the breach, where the French guns thundered out far above the heads of the sailors. They went along none the less merrily for the sound to Djezzar Pasha's garden, where the old Turk sat on his carpet beneath the shade of a great terebinth tree, listening to the interpreter, who made known to him the meaning of the eager speeches of Sir Sidney Smith and the colonel of the marines. As soon as the admiral saw the gallant sailors of HMS Tigre, he interrupted the council of war without much ceremony, and going to Kinraid, he dispatched them, as before arranged, to the North Ravelin, showing them the way with rapid, clear directions. Out of respect to him, they had kept silent while in the strange, desolate garden. But once more in the streets, the old Newcastle song rose up again, till the men were, perforce, silenced by the haste with which they went to the post of danger. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. For many a day these very men had been swearing at the terrific heat at this hour, even when at sea, fanned by the soft breeze. But now, in the midst of hot smoke, with former carnage tainting the air, and with the rush and whiz of death perpetually whistling in their ears, they were uncomplaining and light-hearted. Many an old joke and some new ones came brave and hearty on their cheerful voices, even though the speaker was veiled from sight in great clouds of smoke, cloven only by the bright flames of death. A sudden message came, as many of the crew of the Tigre as were under Lieutenant Kinraid's command were to go down to the mole, to assist the new reinforcements, seen by the sailor from the masthead at day-dawn, under command of Hassan Bey, to land at the mole, where Sir Sidney then was. Off they went, almost as bright and thoughtless as before, though 2 of their number lay silent for ever at the North Ravelin, silenced in that one little half-hour. And one went along with the rest, swearing lustily at his ill luck in having his right arm broken, but ready to do good business with his left. They helped the Turkish troops to land more with good will than tenderness, and then, led by Sir Sidney, They went under the shelter of English guns to the fatal breach, so often assailed, so gallantly defended, but never so fiercely contested as on this burning afternoon. The ruins of the massive wall that here had been broken down by the French were used by them as stepping stones to get on a level with the besieged, and so to escape the heavy stones which the latter hurled down. Nay, even the dead bodies of the morning's comrades were made into ghastly stairs. When Djezzar Pasha heard that the British sailors were defending the breach, headed by Sir Sidney Smith, he left his station in the palace garden, gathered up his robes in haste, and hurried to the breach, where, with his own hands and with right hearty good will, he pulled the sailors down from the post of danger, saying that if he lost his English friends, he lost all. But little recked the crew of the Tigre of the one old man, Pasha or otherwise, who tried to hold them back from the fight. They were up and at the French assailants clambering over the breach in an instant, and so they went on, as if it were some game at play instead of a deadly combat, until Kinraid and his men were called off by Sir Sidney, as the reinforcement of Turkish troops under Hassan Bey were now sufficient for the defence of that old breach in the walls, which was no longer the principal object of the French attack, for the besiegers had made a new and more formidable breach by their incessant fire, knocking down whole streets of the city walls. "Fight your best, Kinraid," said Sir Sidney, "for there's Boney on yonder hill looking at you." And sure enough, on a rising ground, called Richard Coeur de Lion's Mount, there was a half-circle of French generals on horseback, all deferentially attending to the motions, and apparently to the words of a little man in their centre, at whose bidding the aide-de-camp galloped swift with messages to the more distant French camp. The two ravelins which Kinraid and his men had to occupy, for the purpose of sending a flanking fire upon the enemy, were not 10 yards from that enemy's van. But at length there was a sudden rush of the French to that part of the wall where they imagined they could enter unopposed. Surprised at this movement, Kinraid ventured out of the shelter of the ravelin to ascertain the cause. He, safe and untouched during that long afternoon of carnage, fell now under a stray musket shot, and lay helpless and exposed upon the ground, undiscerned by his men, who were recalled to help in the hot reception which had been planned for the French, who, descending the city walls into the Pasha's garden, were attacked with sabre and dagger, and lay headless corpses under the flowering rose-bushes and by the fountain-side. Kinraid lay beyond the ravelins, many yards outside the city walls. He was utterly helpless, for the shot had broken his leg. Dead bodies of Frenchmen lay strewn around him. No Englishman had ventured out so far. All the wounded men that he could see were French, and many of these, furious with pain, gnashed their teeth at him and cursed him aloud, till he thought that his best course was to assume the semblance of death. For some among these men were still capable of dragging themselves up to him, and by concentrating all their failing energies into one blow, put him to a speedy end. The outlying pickets of the French army were within easy rifle shot, and his uniform, although less conspicuous in colour than that of the Marines by whose sides he had been fighting, would make him a sure mark if he so much as moved his arm. Yet how he longed to turn, if ever so slightly, so that the cruel slanting sun might not beat full into his aching eyes. Fever, too, was coming upon him. The pain in his leg was every moment growing more severe. The terrible thirst of the wounded, added to the heat and fatigue of the day, made his lips and tongue feel baked and dry, and his whole throat seemed parched and wooden. Thoughts of other days, of cool Greenland seas, where ice abounded, of grassy English homes, began to make the past more real than the present. With a great effort he brought his wandering senses back. He knew where he was now, and could weigh the chances of his life, which were but small. The unwonted tears came to his eyes as he thought of the newly made wife in her English home, who might never know how he died thinking of her. Suddenly he saw a party of English marines advance under shelter of the ravelin, to pick up the wounded and bear them within the walls for surgical help. They were so near he could see their faces, could hear them speak, yet he durst not make any sign to them when he lay within range of the French pickets' fire. For one moment he could not resist raising his head to give himself a chance for life, before the unclean creatures that infest a camp came round in the darkness of the night to strip and insult the dead bodies, and to put to death such as had yet the breath of life within them. But the setting sun came full into his face, and he saw nothing of what he longed to see. He fell back in despair. He lay there to die. That strong, clear sunbeam had wrought his salvation. He had been recognized as men are recognized when they stand in the red glare of a house on fire. The same despair of help, of hopeless farewell to life, stamped on their faces in blood-red light. One man left his fellows and came running forwards in among the enemy's wounded, within range of their guns. He bent down over Kinraid. He seemed to understand without a word. He lifted him up, carrying him like a child, and with the vehement energy that is more from the force of will than the strength of body, he bore him back to within the shelter of the ravelin, not without many shots being aimed at them, one of which hit Kinraid in the fleshy part of his arm. Kinraid was racked with agony from his dangling broken leg, and his very life seemed leaving him. Yet he remembered afterwards how the marine recalled his fellows, and how, in the pause before they returned, his face became like one formerly known to the six senses of Kinraid. Yet it was too like a dream, too utterly improbable to be real. Yet the few words this man said as he stood breathless and alone by the fainting Kinraid fitted in well with the belief conjured up by his personal appearance. He panted out, "I never thought you'd have kept true to her." And then the others came up, and while they were making a sling of their belts, Kinraid fainted utterly away, and the next time that he was fully conscious, he was lying in his berth in the Tigre, with the ship's surgeon setting his leg. After that he was too feverish for several days to collect his senses. When he could first remember and form a judgment upon his recollections, he called the man especially charged to attend upon him, and bade him go and make inquiry in every possible manner for a marine named Philip Hepburn, and when he was found, to entreat him to come and see Kinraid. The sailor was away the greater part of the day, and returned unsuccessful in his search. He had been from ship to ship, hither and thither. He had questioned all the marines he had met with. No one knew anything of any Philip Hepburn. Kinraid passed a miserably feverish night, and when the doctor exclaimed the next morning at his retrogression, he told him, with some irritation, of the ill success of his servant. He accused the man of stupidity, and wished fervently that he were able to go himself. Partly to soothe him, the doctor promised that he would undertake the search for Hepburn, and he engaged faithfully to follow all Kinraid's eager directions, not to be satisfied with men's careless words, but to look over muster rolls and ship's books. He, too, brought the same answer, however unwillingly given. He had set out upon the search so confident of success that he felt doubly discomfited by failure. However, he had persuaded himself that the lieutenant had been partially delirious from the effects of his wound, and the power of the sun shining down just where he lay. There had indeed been slight symptoms of Kinraid's having received a sunstroke, and the doctor dwelt largely on these in his endeavour to persuade his patient that it was his imagination which had endued a stranger with the lineaments of some former friend. Kinraid threw his arms out of bed with impatience at all this plausible talk, which was even more irritating than the fact that Hepburn was still undiscovered. "The man was no friend of mine. I was like to have killed him when last I saw him. He was a shopkeeper in a country town in England. I had seen little enough of him, but enough to make me able to swear to him anywhere, even in a marine's uniform, and in this sweltering country." Faces once seen, especially in excitement, are apt to return upon the memory in cases of fever, quoth the doctor sententiously. The attendant sailor, reinstalled to some complacency by the failure of another in the search in which he himself had been unsuccessful, now put in his explanation. Maybe it was a spirit. It's not the first time as I've heard of a spirit coming upon earth to save a man's life in time of need. My father had an uncle, a West Country grazier, who was a-coming over Dartmoor and Devonshire one moonlight night with a power of money as he'd got for his sheep at a fair. It were stored in leather bags under the seat of the gig. It were a rough kind of road, both as a road and in character, for there'd been many robberies there of late, and the great rocks stood convenient for hiding places. All at once, father's uncle feels as if someone was sitting beside him on the empty seat, and he turns his head and looks, and there he sees his brother sitting. His brother, as had been dead 12 year and more. So he turns his head back again, eyes right, and never say a word, but wonders what it all means. All of a sudden, 2 fellows come out upon the white road from some black shadow, and they looked, and they let the gig go past, father's uncle driving hard, I warrant you. But for all that he heard one say to the other, Bah, there's 2 on 'em. Straight on he drove faster than ever, till he saw the far lights of some town or other, but I forget its name, though I've heard it many a time. And then he drew a long breath, and turned his head to look at his brother, and ask him how he'd managed to come out of his grave in Barham churchyard, and the seat was as empty as it had been when he set out, and that he knew that it were a spirit come to help him against the men who thought to rob him, and would likely enough have murdered him. Kinraid had kept quiet through this story, but when the sailor began to draw the moral and to say, And I think I may make bold to say, sir, as the marine who carried you out of the French's gunshot was just a spirit come to help you, he exclaimed impatiently, swearing a great oath as he did so. It was no spirit, I tell you, and I was in my full senses. It was a man named Philip Hepburn. He said words to me or over me as none but himself would have said. Yet we hated each other like poison, and I can't make out why he should be there and putting himself in danger to save me. But so it was, and as you can't find him, let me hear no more of your nonsense. It was him, and not my fancy, doctor. It was flesh and blood, and not a spirit, Jack. So get along with you, and leave me quiet. All this time Stephen Freeman lay friendless, sick, and shattered on board the Theseus. He had been about his duty close to some shells that were placed on her deck. A gay young midshipman was thoughtlessly striving to get the fusee out of one of these by a mallet and spike-nail that lay close at hand, and a fearful explosion ensued, in which the poor marine, cleaning his bayonet near, was shockingly burnt and disfigured, the very skin of all the lower part of his face being utterly destroyed by gunpowder. They said it was a mercy that his eyes were spared, but he could hardly feel anything to be a mercy, as he lay tossing in agony, burnt by the explosion, wounded by splinters, and feeling that he was disabled for life, if life itself were preserved. Of all that suffered by that fearful accident, and they were many, none was so forsaken, so hopeless, so desolate, as the Philip Hepburn, about whom such anxious inquiries were being made at that very time. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shushan. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 39, Confidences. It was a little later on in that same summer that Mrs. Brunton came to visit her sister Bessie. Bessie was married to a tolerably well-to-do farmer, who lived at an almost equal distance between Monkshaven and Hartswell, but from old habit and convenience, the latter was regarded as the Dawsons' market town, so Bessie seldom or never saw her old friends in Monkshaven. But Mrs. Brunton was far too flourishing a person not to speak out her wishes, and have her own way. She had no notion, she said, of coming such a long journey only to see Bessie and her husband, and not to have a sight of her former acquaintances at Monkshaven. She might have added, that her new bonnet and cloak would be as good as lost if it was not displayed among those who, knowing her as Molly Corney, and being less fortunate in matrimony than she was, would look upon it with wondering admiration, if not with envy. So one day Farmer Dawson's market cart deposited Mrs. Brunton, in all her bravery, at the shop in the market-place, over which Hepburn and Coulson's names still flourished in joint partnership. After a few words of brisk recognition to Coulson and Hester, Mrs. Brunton passed on into the parlour and greeted Sylvia with boisterous heartiness. It was now 4 years and more since the friends had met, and each secretly wondered how they had ever come to be friends. Sylvia had a country, raw, spiritless look to Mrs. Brunton's eye. Molly was loud and talkative, and altogether distasteful to Sylvia, trained in daily companionship with Hester to appreciate soft, slow speech and grave, thoughtful ways. However, they kept up the forms of their old friendship, though their hearts had drifted far apart. They sat hand in hand, while each looked at the other with eyes inquisitive as to the changes which time had made. Molly was the first to speak.
"Well, to be sure, how thin and pale you've grown, Sylvia. Matrimony hasn't agreed with you as well as it's done with me. Brunton is always saying, you know what a man he is for his joke, that if he'd ha' known how many yards of silk I should ha' taken for a gown, he'd ha' thought twice afore he'd ha' married me. Why, I've gained a matter of 30 pound of flesh than I were married."
"You do look brave and hearty," said Sylvia, putting her sense of her companion's capacious size and high colour into the prettiest words she could.
Sylvia, but I know what it is," said Molly, shaking her head. "It's just because of that husband of thine as has gone and left thee. Thou's pining after him, and he's not worth it. Brunton said when he heard on it, I mind he was smoking at the time, and he took his pipe out of his mouth, and shook out to ashes as grave as any judge. 'The man,' says he, 'as can desert a wife like Sylvia Robson as was, deserves hanging.' That's what he says. Sylvia, but speaking of hanging, I was so grieved for you when I heard of your poor feyther. Such an end for a decent man to come to. Many a one come and called on me a purpose to hear all I could tell him about him."
"Please don't speak on it," said Sylvia, trembling all over.
"Well, poor creature, I would not. It is hard on thee, I grant, but to give the devil his due, it were good i' Hepburn to marry thee, and so soon after there was all that talk about thy feyther. Many a man would ha' drawn back, choose however far they'd gone. I'm not so sure about Charlie Kinraid. Sylvia, only think on his being alive after all. I doubt if our Bessie would ha' wed Frank Dawson if she'd known as he wasn't drowned. But it's as well she did, for Dawson's a man of property, and has getten 12 cows in his cow-house, beside 3 right down good horses. And Kinraid were allays a fellow with 2 strings to his bow. I've allays said, and do maintain, that he went on pretty strong with you, Sylvie. And I will say I think he cared more for you than for our Bessie, though it were only yesterday at e'en she were standing out that he liked her better than you. You'll ha' heard on his grand marriage?"
"No," said Sylvia, with eager, painful curiosity.
"No, it was in all the papers. I wonder as you didn't see it. Wait a minute. I cut it out of the gentleman's magazine as Brunton bought a purpose, and put it in my pocket book when I were a-coming here. I know I've got it somewhere."
She took out her smart crimson pocket-book, and rummaged in the pocket until she produced a little crumpled bit of printed paper, from which she read aloud.
"On January the 3rd, at St. Mary Redcliffe, Bristol, Charles Kinraid, Esquire, Lieutenant Royal Navy, to Miss Clarinda Jackson, with the fortune of 10,000 pounds. "There!" she said triumphantly. "It's something as Brunton says to be cousin to that."
"Would you let me see it?" said Sylvia timidly. Mrs. Brunton graciously consented, and Sylvia brought her newly acquired reading knowledge, hitherto principally exercised on the Old Testament, to bear on these words. There was nothing wonderful in them, nothing that she might not have expected, and yet the surprise turned her giddy for a moment or two. She never thought of seeing him again, never,
But to think of his caring for another woman as much as he had done for her, nay, perhaps more! The idea was irresistibly forced upon her that Philip would not have acted so. It would have taken long years before he could have been induced to put another on the throne she had once occupied. For the first time in her life she seemed to recognize the real nature of Philip's love. But she said nothing but "Thank you" when she gave the scrap of paper back to Molly Brunton, and the latter continued giving her information about Kinraid's marriage. "He were down into West, Plymouth or somewhere, when he met with her. She's no feyther. He'd been into sugar baking business, but from what Kinraid wrote to old Turner, the uncle has brought him up at Cullercoats. She's had the best of educations, can play on to instrument and dance to shawl dance. And Kinraid had all her money settled on her, though she said she'd rather give it all to him, which I must say, being his cousin, was very pretty on her. He's left her now, having to go off into Tigre, as is his ship, to the Mediterranean seas, and she's written to offer to come and see old Turner, and make friends with his relations, and Brunton is going to give me a crimson satin as soon as we know for certain when she's coming, for we're sure to be asked out to Cullercoats." "I wonder if she's very pretty?" asked Sylvia faintly, in the first pause in this torrent of talk. "Oh, she's a perfect beauty, as I understand. There was a traveller as come to our shop as had been at York, and knew some of her cousins there that were into grocery line. Her mother was a York lady, and they said she was just a picture of a woman, and ever so many gentlemen had been wanting to marry her, but she just waited for Charlie Kinraid, you see." "Well, I hope they'll be happy. I'm sure I do," said Sylvia. "That's just luck. Some folks is happy in marriage, and some isn't. It's just luck, and there's no forecasting it. Men is such unaccountable animals, there's no prophesying upon 'em. Who'd have thought of your husband, him as was so slow and sure, steady Philip, as we lasses used to call him, making a moonlight flitting, and leaving you to be a widow bewitched?" "He didn't go at night," said Sylvia, taking the words moonlight flitting in their literal sense. "No. Well, I only said moonlight flitting just because it come uppermost, and I knowed no better. Tell me all about it, Sylvie, for I can't make it out from what Bessie says. Had he and you had words? But in course you had." At this moment Hester came into the room, and Sylvia joyfully availed herself of the pretext for breaking off the conversation that had reached this painful and awkward point. She detained Hester in the room for fear lest Mrs. Brunton should repeat her inquiry as to how it all happened that Philip had gone away. But the presence of a third person seemed as though it would be but little restraint upon the inquisitive Molly, who repeatedly bore down upon the same questions till she nearly drove Sylvia distracted, between her astonishment at the news of Kinraid's marriage, her wish to be alone and quiet so as to realize the full meaning of that piece of intelligence, her desire to retain Hester in the conversation, her efforts to prevent Molly's recurrence to the circumstances of Philip's disappearance, and the longing, more vehement every minute, for her visitor to go away and leave her in peace. She became so disturbed with all these thoughts and feelings that she hardly knew what she was saying, and assented or dissented to speeches without there being either any reason or truth in her words. Mrs. Brunton had arranged to remain with Sylvia while the horse rested, and had no compunction about the length of her visit. She expected to be asked to tea, as Sylvia found out at last, and this she felt would be the worst of all, as Alice Rose was not one to tolerate the coarse, careless talk of such a woman as Mrs. Brunton, without lifting her voice in many a testimony against it. Sylvia sat holding Hester's gown tight in order to prevent her leaving the room, and trying to arrange her little plans so that too much discordance should not arise to the surface. Just then the door opened, and little Bella came in from the kitchen in all the pretty, sturdy dignity of 2 years old, Alice following her with careful steps, and protecting outstretched arms, a slow smile softening the sternness of her grave face, for the child was the unconscious darling of the household, and all eyes softened into love as they looked on her. She made straight for her mother with something grasped in her little dimpled fist, but halfway across the room she seemed to have become suddenly aware of the presence of a stranger, and she stopped short, fixing her serious eyes full on Mrs. Brunton, as if to take in her appearance, nay, as if to penetrate down into her very real self, and then, stretching out her disengaged hand, the baby spoke out the words that had been hovering about her mother's lips for an hour past. "Go away," said Bella decisively. "What a perfect love!" said Mrs. Brunton, half in real admiration, half in patronage. As she spoke, she got up and went towards the child, as if to take her up. "Don't away! Don't away!" cried Bella in shrill affright at this movement. "Do not," said Sylvia. "She's shy. She doesn't know strangers." But Mrs. Brunton had grasped the struggling, kicking child by this time, and her reward for this was a vehement little slap in the face. "You naughty little spoiled thing," said she, setting Bella down in a hurry. "You deserve a good whipping, you do, and if you were mine you should have it." Sylvia had no need to stand up for the baby who had run to her arms, and was soothing herself with sobbing on her mother's breast, for Alice took up the defence. "The child said as plain as words could say, 'Go away,' and if thou wouldst follow thine own will instead of heeding her wish, thou mun put up with the wilfulness of the old Adam, of which it seems to me thou hast getten thy share at 30 as well as little Bella at 2. 30? said Mrs. Brunton, now fairly affronted. 30? Why, Sylvia, you know I'm but 2 years older than you. Speak to that woman and tell her as I'm only 24. 30 indeed." "Molly's but 24, said Sylvia in a pacificatory tone. "Whether she be 20 or 30 or 40 is alike to me," said Alice. "I meant no harm. I meant but for to say as her angry words to the child bespoke her to be one of the foolish. I know not who she is, nor what her age may be." "She's an old friend of mine," said Sylvia. "She's Mrs. Brunton now, but when I knowed her she was Molly Corney." "Ay, and you were Sylvia Robson, and as bonny and light-hearted a lass as any in all to riding, though now you're a poor widow bewitched, left wi' a child as I mustn't speak a word about, and living wi' folk as talk about t' old Adam as if he wasn't dead and done wi' long ago. It's a change, Sylvia, as makes my heart ache for you, to think on them old days when you were so thought on you might have had any man, as Brunton often says. It were a great mistake as you iver took up wi' yon man as has run away. But 7 year'll soon be past fra' t' time he went off, and you'll only be 26 then. And there'll be a chance of a better husband for you after all, so keep up your heart, Sylvia." Molly Brunton had put as much venom as she knew how into this speech, meaning it as a vengeful payment for the supposition of her being 30, even more than for the reproof for her angry words about the child. She thought that Alice Rose must be either mother or aunt to Philip, from the serious cast of countenance that was remarkable in both, and she rather exulted in the allusion to a happier second marriage for Sylvia, with which she had concluded her speech. It roused Alice, however, as effectually as if she had been really a blood relation to Philip, but for a different reason. She was not slow to detect the intentional offensiveness to herself in what had been said. She was indignant at Sylvia for suffering the words spoken to pass unanswered. But in truth, they were too much in keeping with Molly Brunton's character to make as much impression on Sylvia as they did on a stranger. And besides, she felt as if the less reply Molly received, the less likely would it be that she would go on in the same strain. So she coaxed and chattered to her child, and behaved like a little coward in trying to draw out of the conversation, while at the same time listening attentively. "As for Sylvia Hepburn as was Sylvia Robson, she knows my mind," said Alice in grim indignation. "She's humbling herself now, I trust and pray. But she was light-minded and full of vanity when Philip married her, and it might have been a lift towards her salvation in one way. But it pleased the Lord to work in a different way, and she mun wear her sackcloth and ashes in patience. So I'll say not more about her. But for him as is absent as thee has spoken on so lightly and reproachfully, I'd have thee to know he were one of a different kind to any thee ever knew, I reckon. If he were led away by a pretty face to slight one as was fitter for him, and who had loved him as the apple of her eye, it's him as is suffering for it, inasmuch as he's a wanderer from his home, and an outcast from wife and child." To the surprise of all, Molly's words of reply were cut short even when they were on her lips, by Sylvia. Pale, fire-eyed, and excited, with Philip's child on one arm and the other stretched out, she said, "No one can tell, no one know. No one shall speak a judgment twixt Philip and me. He acted cruel and wrong by me, but I've said my words to him hisself, and I'm not going to make any plaint to others. Only them as know should judge. And it's not fitting, it's not," almost sobbing, "to go on with talk like this afore me." The two,
For Hester, who was aware that her presence had only been desired by Sylvia as a check to an unpleasant tete-a-tete conversation, had slipped back to her business as soon as her mother came in. The two looked with surprise at Sylvia. Her words, her whole manner, belonged to a phase of her character which seldom came uppermost, and which had not been perceived by either of them before. Alice Rose, though astonished, rather approved of Sylvia's speech. It showed that she had more serious thought and feeling on the subject than the old woman had given her credit for. Her general silence respecting her husband's disappearance had led Alice to think that she was too childish to have received any deep impression from the event. Molly Brunton gave vent to her opinion on Sylvia's speech in the following words.
"Hoity-toity, that tells tales, lass. If you treated steady Philip to many such looks and speeches as yo'n given us now, it's easy to see why he took hisself off. Why, Sylvia, I niver saw it in you when you was a girl. You're grown into a regular little vixen, there where you stand."
Indeed, she did look defiant, with the swift colour flushing her cheeks to crimson on its return, and the fire in her eyes not yet died away. But at Molly's jesting words she sank back into her usual look and manner, only saying quietly, "It's for noane to say whether I'm vixen or not, as doesn't know the past things as is buried in my heart. But I cannot hold them as my friends as go on talking on either my husband or me before my very face. What he was, I know, and what I am, I reckon he knows. And now I'll go hurry tea, for you'll be needing it, Molly." The last clause of this speech was meant to make peace, but Molly was in 20 minds as to whether she should accept the olive branch or not. Her temper, however, was of that obtuse kind which is not easily ruffled. Her mind, stagnant in itself, enjoyed excitement from without, and her appetite was invariably good, so she stayed, in spite of the inevitable tete-a-tete with Alice. The latter, however, refused to be drawn into conversation again, replying to Mrs. Brunton's speeches with a curt yes or no, when indeed she replied at all. When all were gathered at tea, Sylvia was quite calm again, rather paler than usual, and very attentive and subdued in her behaviour to Alice. She would evidently fain have been silent, but as Molly was her own especial guest, that could not be, so all her endeavours went towards steering the conversation away from any awkward points. But each of the four, let alone little Bella, was thankful when the market cart drew up at the shop door that was to take Mrs. Brunton back to her sister's house. When she was fairly off, Alice Rose opened her mouth in strong condemnation, winding up with, "And if aught in my words give thee cause for offence, Sylvia, it was because my heart rose within me at that kind of talk thee and she had been having about Philip, and her evil and light-minded counsel to thee about waiting 7 years and then wedding another." Hard as these words may seem when repeated, there was something of a nearer approach to an apology in Mrs. Rose's manner than Sylvia had ever seen in it before. She was silent for a few moments, then she said, "I ha' often thought of telling you and Hester special like, when you've been so kind to my little Bella, that Philip and me could never come together again, no, not if he came home this very night." She would have gone on speaking, but Hester interrupted her with a low cry of dismay. Alice said, "Hush thee, Hester. It's no business of thine. Sylvia Hepburn, thou art speaking like a silly child." "No, I am speaking like a woman as finds out she's been cheated by men as she trusted, and has no help for it. I'm not going to say any more about it. It's me as has been wronged and as has to bear it. Only I thought I'd tell you both this much, that you might know somewhat why he went away, and how I said my last word about it." So indeed it seemed. To all questions and remonstrances from Alice, Sylvia turned a deaf ear. She averted her face from Hester's sad, wistful looks. Only when they were parting for the night at the top of the little staircase she turned, and putting her arms round Hester's neck, she laid her head on her neck and whispered, "Poor Hester, poor, poor Hester! If you and he had but been married together, what a deal of sorrow would have been spared to us all." Hester pushed her away as she finished these words, looked searchingly into her face, her eyes, and then followed Sylvia into her room, where Bella lay sleeping, shut the door, and almost knelt down at Sylvia's feet, clasping her, and hiding her face in the folds of the other's gown. "Sylvia, Sylvia," she murmured, "some one has told you. I thought no one knew. It's no sin. It's done away with now. Indeed it is. It was long ago, before you were married. But I cannot forget. It was a shame, perhaps, to have thought on it ever, when he never thought of me. But I never believed as any one could have found it out. I'm just fit to sink into ground, what with my sorrow and my shame." Hester was stopped by her own rising sobs immediately she was in Sylvia's arms. Sylvia was sitting on the ground holding her and soothing her with caresses and broken words.
"I'm always saying the wrong things," said she. "It seems as if I were all upset to-day, and indeed I am," she added, alluding to the news of Kinraid's marriage she had yet to think upon. "But it wasn't you, Hester. It were nothing you ever said or did, or looked for that matter. It were your mother as let it out." "Oh, mother, mother!" wailed out Hester. "I niver thought as any one but God would ha' known that I had ever for a day thought on his being more to me than a brother."
Sylvia made no reply, only went on stroking Hester's smooth brown hair, off which her cap had fallen. Sylvia was thinking how strange life was, and how love seemed to go all at cross purposes, and was losing herself in bewilderment at the mystery of the world. She was almost startled when Hester rose up, and taking Sylvia's hands in both of hers, and looking solemnly at her, said,
"Sylvia, you know what has been my trouble and my shame, and I'm sure you're sorry for me. For I will humble myself to you, and own that for many months before you were married, I felt my disappointment like a heavy burden laid on me by day and by night. But now I ask you if you've any pity for me for what I went through, or if you've any love for me because of your dead mother's love for me, or because of any fellowship or daily friendliness between us two. Put the hard thoughts of Philip away from out of your heart. He may ha' done you wrong, anyway you think that he has. I never knew him aught but kind and good. But if he comes back from wherever in the wide world he's gone to, and there's not a night but I pray God to keep him and send him safe back, you put away the memory of past injury, and forgive it all, and be what you can be, Sylvia, if you've a mind to, just the kind, good wife he ought to have."
"I cannot. You know nothing about it, Hester."
"Tell me then,"
pleaded Hester.
"No," said Sylvia, after a moment's hesitation. "I'd do a deal for you, I would, but I daren't forgive Philip, even if I could. I took a great oath again him. You may look shocked at me, but it's him as you ought for to be shocked at if you knew all. I said I'd never forgive him. I shall keep to my word." "I think I'd better pray for his death, then," said Hester, hopelessly, and almost bitterly, losing her hold on Sylvia's hands. "If it weren't for baby there, I could think as it were my death as'd be best. Them as one thinks to most on forgets one soonest."
It was Kinraid to whom she was alluding, but Hester did not understand her, and after standing for a moment in silence, she kissed her and left her for the night. End of chapter 39. Recording by Shushan.
Chapter 40 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Majlinger. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 40. An Unexpected Messenger. After this agitation and these partial confidences, no more was said on the subject of Philip for many weeks. They avoided even the slightest allusion to him, and none of them knew how seldom or how often he might be present in the minds of the others. One day the little Bella was unusually fractious with some slight childish indisposition, and Sylvia was obliged to have recourse to the never-failing piece of amusement, namely to take the child into the shop, when the number of new, bright-coloured articles was sure to beguile the little girl out of her fretfulness. She was walking along the high terrace of the counter, kept steady to her mother's hand, when Mr. Dawson's market cart once more stopped before the door. But it was not Mrs. Brunton who alighted now. It was a very smartly dressed, very pretty young lady, who put one dainty foot before the other with care, as if descending from such a primitive vehicle were a new occurrence in her life. Then she looked up at the names above the shop door, and after ascertaining that this was indeed the place she desired to find, she came in blushing. "Is Mrs. Hepburn at home?" she asked of Hester, whose position in the shop brought her forward to receive the new customers, while Sylvia drew Bella out of sight behind some great bales of red flannel. "Can I see her?" a sweet south country voice went on, still addressing Hester. Sylvia heard the inquiry, and came forwards, with a little rustic awkwardness, feeling both shy and curious. "Will you please walk this way, ma'am?" said she, leading her visitor back into her own dominion of the parlour, and leaving Bella to Hester's willing care. "You don't know me," said the pretty young lady joyously. "But I think you knew my husband. I am Mrs. Kinraid." A sob of surprise rose to Sylvia's lips. She choked it down, however, and tried to conceal any emotion she might feel, in placing a chair for her visitor, and trying to make her welcome, although, if the truth must be told, Sylvia was wondering all the time why her visitor came, and how soon she would go. "You knew Captain Kinraid, did you not?" said the young lady, with innocent inquiry, to which Sylvia's lips formed the answer "yes," but no clear sound issued therefrom. "But I know your husband knew the captain. Is he at home yet? Can I speak to him? I do so want to see him." Sylvia was utterly bewildered. Mrs. Kinraid, this pretty, joyous, prosperous little bird of a woman, Philip, Charlie's wife, what could they have in common? What could they know of each other? All she could say in answer to Mrs. Kinraid's eager question, and still more eager looks, was, that her husband was from home, had been long from home. She did not know where he was, she did not know when he would come back. Mrs. Kinraid's face fell a little, partly from her own real disappointment, partly out of sympathy with the hopeless, indifferent tone of Sylvia's replies. "Mrs. Dawson told me he had gone away rather suddenly a year ago, but I thought he might be come home by now. I am expecting the captain early next month. Oh, how I should have liked to see Mr. Hepburn, and to thank him for saving the captain's life." "What do you mean?" asked Sylvia, stirred out of all assumed indifference. "The captain? Is that—" Not Charlie, she could not use that familiar name to the pretty young wife before her. "Your husband?" "Yes, you knew him, didn't you? When he used to be staying with Mr. Corney, his uncle?" "Yes, I knew him. But I don't understand. Will you please to tell me all about it, ma'am?" said Sylvia, faintly. "I thought your husband would have told you all about it. I hardly know where to begin. You know my husband is a sailor." Sylvia nodded assent, listening greedily, her heart beating thick all the time. "And he is now a commander in the Royal Navy, all earned by his own bravery. Oh, I am so proud of him." So could Sylvia have been if she had been his wife. As it was, she thought how often she had felt sure that he would be a great man some day. "And he has been at the siege of Acre." Sylvia looked perplexed at these strange words, and Mrs. Kinraid caught the look. "Sonja in the Acre, you know. Though it's fine saying you know when I didn't know a bit about it myself till the captain's ship was ordered there, though I was head girl at Miss Dobbin's in the geography class. Acre is a seaport town, not far from Jaffa, which is the modern name of Joppa, where St. Paul went to long ago. You've read of that, I'm sure, and Mount Carmel, where the prophet Elijah was once, all in Palestine. You know, only the Turks have got it now." "But I don't understand yet," said Sylvia, plaintively. "I dare say it is all very true about St. Paul, but please, ma'am, will you tell me about your husband and mine? Have they met again?" "Yes, at Acre, I tell you," said Mrs. Kinraid, with pretty petulance. "The Turks held the town, and the French wanted to take it, and we, that is the British fleet, wouldn't let them. So Sir Sidney Smith, a commodore and a great friend of the captain's, landed in order to fight the French, and the captain and many of the sailors landed with him, and it was burning hot, and the poor captain was wounded, and lay a dying of pain and thirst within the enemy's, that is the French, fire, so that they were ready to shoot any one of his own side who came near him. They thought he was dead himself, you see, as he was very near, and would have been too, if her husband had not come out of shelter, and taken him up in his arms, or in his back, I couldn't make out which, and carried him safe within the walls." "It couldn't have been Philip," said Sylvia, dubiously. "But it was. The captain says so, and he's not a man to be mistaken. I thought I got his letter with me, and I would have read you a part of it, but I left it at Mrs. Dawson's in my desk, and I can't send it to you," blushing as she remembered certain passages in which the captain wrote very much like a lover. "Or else I would, but you may be quite sure it was your husband that ventured into all that danger to save his old friend's life, or the captain would not have said so." "But they weren't, not to call great friends." I wish I got the letter here. I can't think how I could be so stupid. I think I can almost remember the very words, though. I've read them over so often. He says, 'Just as I gave up all hope, I saw one Philip Hepburn, a man whom I had known at Monkshaven, and whom I had some reason to remember well.' I am sure he says so, remember well. He saw me too, and came at the risk of his life to where I lay. I fully expected he would be shot down, and I shut my eyes not to see the end of my last chance. The shot rained about him, and I think he was hit, but he took me up and carried me under cover. I'm sure he says that. I read it over so often, and he goes on and says how he hunted for Mr. Hepburn all through the ships, as soon as ever he could, but he could not hear nothing of him, either alive or dead." "Don't go so white, for pity's sake," said she, suddenly startled by Sylvia's blanching colour. "You see, because he couldn't find him alive is no reason for giving him up as dead, because his name wasn't to be found on any of the ship's books. So the captain thinks he must have been known by a different name to his real one. Only he says he should like to have seen him, to have thanked him, and he says he would give a deal to know what has become of him. And as I was staying 2 days at Mrs. Dawson's, I told them I must come over to Monkshaven, if only for 5 minutes, just to hear if your good husband was come home, and to shake his hands, that helped to save my own dear captain." "I don't think it could have been Philip," reiterated Sylvia. "Why not?" asked her visitor. "You say you don't know where he is. Why mightn't he have been there where the captain says he was?" "But he wasn't a sailor, nor yet a soldier." "Oh, but he was. I think somewhere the captain calls him a marine. That's neither one nor the other, but a little of both. He'll be coming home some day soon, and then you'll see." Alice Rose came in at this minute, and Mrs. Kinraid jumped to the conclusion that she was Sylvia's mother, and in her overflowing gratitude and friendliness all to the family of him who had saved the captain, she went forward, and shook the old woman's hand in a pleasant confiding way that wins all hearts. "Here's your daughter, ma'am," she said to the half-astonished, half-pleased Alice. "I'm Mrs. Kinraid, the wife of the captain that used to be in these parts, and I've come to bring her news of her husband, and she don't half believe me, though it's all to his credit, I'm sure." Alice looked so perplexed that Sylvia felt herself bound to explain. "She says he's either a soldier or a sailor, and a long way off at some place named in the Bible." "Philip Hepburn led away to be a soldier," said she, "who had once been a Quaker." "Yes, and a very brave one too, and one that it would do my heart good to look upon," exclaimed Mrs. Kinraid. "He's been saving my husband's life in the Holy Land, where Jerusalem is, you know." "Nay," said Alice, a little scornfully, "I can forgive Sylvia for not being keen to credit thy news. Her man of peace becoming a man of war, and suffered to enter Jerusalem, which is a heavenly and a typical city all this time, while me, as is one of the elect, is obliged to go on dwelling in Monkshaven, just like any other body." "Nay, but," said Mrs. Kinraid gently, seeing she was touching on delicate ground, "I did not say he had gone to Jerusalem, but my husband saw him at those parts, and he was doing his duty like a brave, good man. Ay, and more than his duty, and, you may take my word for it, he'll be at home some day soon, and all I beg is that you'll let the captain and me know, for I'm sure if we can, we'll both come and pay our respects to him. And I'm very glad I've seen you," said she, rising to go, and putting out her hand to shake that of Sylvia, "for, besides being Hepburn's wife, I'm pretty sure I've heard the captain speak of you, and if ever you come to Bristol I hope you'll come and see us on Clifton Downs." She went away, leaving Sylvia almost stunned by the new ideas presented to her. Philip a soldier! Philip in a battle, risking his life! Most strange of all, Charlie and Philip once more meeting together, not as rivals or as foes, but as saviour and saved! Add to all this the conviction, strengthened by every word that happy, loving wife had uttered, that Kinraid's old passionate love for herself had faded away, and vanished utterly. Its very existence apparently blotted out of his memory. She had torn up her love for him by the roots, but she felt as if she could never forget that it had been. Hester brought back Bella to her mother. She had not liked to interrupt the conversation with the strange lady before, and now she found her mother in an obvious state of excitement, Sylvia quieter than usual. "That was Kinraid's wife, Hester. Him that was the specksioneer as made such a noise about the place at the time of Darley's death. He is now a captain, a navy captain, according what she says. And she would fain have us believe that Philip is abiding in all manner of Scripture places as has been long done away with, but the similitude whereof is in the heavens, where the elect shall one day see them. And she says Philip is there, and a soldier, and that he saved her husband's life, and is coming home soon. I wonder what John and Jeremiah will say to his soldiering then. It will be known to be their taste, I'm thinking." It was all very intelligible to Hester, and she would dearly have liked to question Sylvia, but Sylvia sat a little apart, with Bella on her knee, her cheek resting on her child's golden curls, and her eyes fixed and almost trance-like, as if she were seeing things not present. So Hester had to be content with asking her mother as many elucidatory questions as she could, and after all did not gain a very clear idea of what had really been said by Mrs. Kinraid, as her mother was more full of the apparent injustice of Philip's being allowed the privilege of treading on holy ground, if, indeed, that holy ground existed on this side heaven, which she was inclined to dispute, than to confine herself to the repetition of words or narration of facts. Suddenly Sylvia roused herself to a sense of Hester's deep interest and balked inquiries, and she went over the ground rapidly. "Your mother says right. She is his wife, and he's always fighting, and got too near to French, as was shooting and firing all around him. And just then, according to her story, Philip saw him, and went straight into the midst of the shots, and fetched him out of danger. That's what she says, and upholds." "And why should it not be?" asked Hester, her cheek flushing. But Sylvia only shook her head, and said, "I cannot tell. It may be so. But they had little cause to be friends, and it seems all so strange. Philip a soldier, and a meeting there after all." Hester laid the story of Philip's bravery to her heart. She fully believed in it. Sylvia pondered it more deeply still. The causes of her disbelief, or, at any rate, for her wonder, were unknown to Hester. Many a time she sank to sleep with the picture of her Eleven narrated by Mrs. Kinraid as present to her mind as her imagination or experience could make it. First one figure prominent, then another. Many a morning she wakened up, her heart beating wildly, why she knew not, till she shuddered at the remembrance of the scenes that passed in her dreams, scenes that might be acted in reality that very day, for Philip might come back, and then? Then where was Philip all this time, these many weeks, these heavily passing months? End of chapter 40.
Chapter 41 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 41. The Bedesman of St. Sepulchre. Philip lay long ill on board the hospital ship. If his heart had been light, he might have rallied sooner, but he was so depressed he did not care to live. His shattered jawbone, his burnt and blackened face, his many injuries of body, were torture to both his physical frame and his sick, weary heart. No more chance for him, if indeed there ever had been any, of returning gay and gallant, and thus regaining his wife's love. This had been his poor, foolish vision in the first hour of his enlistment, and the vain dream had recurred more than once in the feverish stage of excitement which the new scenes into which he had been hurried as a recruit had called forth. But that was all over now. He knew that it was the most unlikely thing in the world to have come to pass, and yet those were happy days when he could think of it as barely possible. Now all he could look forward to was disfigurement, feebleness, and the bare pittance that keeps pensioners from absolute want. Those around him were kind enough to him in their fashion, and attended to his bodily requirements, but they had no notion of listening to any revelations of unhappiness. if Philip had been the man to make confidences of that kind. As it was, he lay very still in his berth, seldom asking for anything, and always saying he was better when the ship surgeon came round with his daily inquiries. But he did not care to rally, and was rather sorry to find that his case was considered so interesting in a surgical point of view, that he was likely to receive a good deal more than the average amount of attention. Perhaps it was owing to this that he recovered at all. The doctors said it was the heat that made him languid, for that his wounds and burns were all doing well at last, and by they told him they had ordered him home. His pulse sank under the surgeon's finger at the mention of the word, but he did not say a word. He was too indifferent to life and the world to have a will. Otherwise they might have kept their pet patient a little longer where he was. Slowly passing from ship to ship as occasion served, resting here and there in garrison hospitals, Philip at length reached Portsmouth on the evening of a September day in 1799. The transport ship in which he was loaded with wounded and invalided soldiers and sailors. All who could manage it in any way struggled on deck to catch the first view of the white coasts of England. One man lifted his arm, took off his cap, and feebly waved it aloft, crying, "Old England forever!" in a faint shrill voice, and then burst into tears and sobbed aloud. Others tried to pipe up Rule Britannia, while more sate, weak and motionless, looking towards the shores that once, not so long ago, they never thought to see again. Philip was one of these, his place a little apart from the other men. He was muffled up in a great military cloak that had been given him by one of his officers. He felt the September breeze chill after his sojourn in a warmer climate and in his shattered state of health. As the ship came in sight of Portsmouth harbour, the signal flags ran up the ropes. The beloved Union Jack floated triumphantly over all. Return signals were made from the harbour. On board, all became bustle and preparation for landing, while on shore there was the evident movement of expectation, and men in uniform were seen pressing their way to the front, as if to them belonged the right of reception. They were the men from the barrack hospital that had been signalled for, come down with ambulance litters and other marks of forethought for the sick and wounded, who were returning to the country for which they had fought and suffered. With a dash and a great rocking swing, the vessel came up to her appointed place, and was safely moored. Philip sat still, almost as if he had no part in the cries of welcome, the bustling care, the loud directions that cut the air around him, and pierced his nerves through and through. But one in authority gave the order, and Philip, disciplined to obedience, rose to find his knapsack and leave the ship. Passive as he seemed to be, he had his likings for particular comrades. There was one especially, a man as different from Philip as well could be, to whom the latter had always attached himself, a merry fellow from Somersetshire, who was almost always cheerful and bright, though Philip had overheard the doctors say he would never be the man he was before he had that shot through the side. This marine would often sit making his fellows laugh, and laughing himself at his own good-humoured jokes, till so terrible a fit of coughing came on that those around him feared he would die in the paroxysm. After one of these fits he had gasped out some words, which led Philip to question him a little, and it turned out that in the quiet little village of Potterne, far inland, nestled beneath the high stretches of Salisbury Plain, he had a wife and a child, a little girl, just the same age even to a week as Philip's own little Bella. It was this that drew Philip towards the man, and this that made Philip wait and go ashore along with the poor consumptive marine. The litters had moved off towards the hospital. The sergeant in charge had given his words of command to the remaining invalids, who tried to obey them to the best of their power, falling into something like military order for their march. But soon, very soon, the weakest broke step and lagged behind, and felt as if the rough welcomes and rude expressions of sympathy from the crowd around were almost too much for them. Philip and his companion were about midway, when suddenly a young woman with a child in her arms forced herself through the people, between the soldiers who kept pressing on either side, and threw herself on the neck of Philip's friend. "Oh, Jem," she sobbed, "I've walked all the road from Potterne. I've never stopped but for food and rest for Nelly. Now I've got you once again. I've got you once again. Bless God for it." She did not seem to see the deadly change that had come over her husband since she parted with him a ruddy young labourer. She had got him once again, as she phrased it, and that was enough for her. She kissed his face, his hands, his very coat, nor would she be repulsed from walking beside him and holding his hand, while her little girl ran along scared by the voices and the strange faces, and clinging to her mammy's gown. Jem coughed, poor fellow. He coughed his churchyard cough, and Philip bitterly envied him, envied his life, envied his approaching death. For was he not wrapped round with that woman's tender love? And is not such love stronger than death? Philip had felt as if his own heart was grown numb, as though it had changed to a cold, heavy stone. But at the contrast of this man's lot to his own, he felt that he had yet the power of suffering left to him. The road they had to go was full of people, kept off in some measure by the guard of soldiers. All sorts of kindly speeches, and many a curious question, were addressed to the poor invalids as they walked along. Philip's jaw and the lower part of his face were bandaged up. His cap was slouched down. He held his cloak about him, and shivered within its folds. They came to a standstill from some slight obstacle at the corner of a street. Down the causeway of this street a naval officer with a lady on his arm was walking briskly, with a step that told of health and a light heart. He stayed his progress, though, when he saw the convoy of maimed and wounded men. He said something, of which Philip only caught the words, "Same uniform," for his sake, to the young lady, whose cheek blanched a little, but whose eyes kindled. Then, leaving her for an instant, he pressed forward. He was close to Philip. Poor sad Philip, absorbed in his own thoughts, so absorbed that he noticed nothing till he heard a voice at his ear, having the Northumbrian burr, the Newcastle inflections which he knew of old, and that were to him like the sick memory of a deadly illness. And then he turned his muffled face to the speaker, though he knew well enough who it was, and averted his eyes after one side of the handsome, happy man, the man whose life he had saved once, and would save again, at the risk of his own, but whom, for all that, he prayed he might never meet more on earth. "Here, my fine fellow, take this," forcing a crown piece into Philip's hand. "I wish it were more. I'd give you £1 if I had it with me." Philip muttered something, and held out the coin to Captain Kinraid, of course in vain, nor was there time to urge it back upon the giver, for the obstacle to their progress was suddenly removed. The crowd pressed upon the captain and his wife, the procession moved on, and Philip along with it, holding the piece in his hand, and longing to throw it far away. Indeed, he was on the point of dropping it, hoping to do so unperceived, when he bethought him of giving it to Jem's wife, the footsore woman limping happily along by her husband's side. They thanked him, and spoke in his praise more than he could well bear. It was no credit to him to give that away which burned his fingers as long as he kept it. Philip knew that the injuries he had received in the explosion on board the Theseus would oblige him to leave the service. He also believed that they would entitle him to a pension, but he had little interest in his future life. He was without hope, and in a depressed state of health. He remained for some little time stationary, and then went through all the forms of dismissal on account of wounds received in service, and was turned out loose upon the world, uncertain where to go, indifferent as to what became of him. It was fine, warm October weather as he turned his back upon the coast and set off on his walk northwards. Green leaves were yet upon the trees, the hedges were of one flush of foliage, and the wild, rough-flavoured fruits of different kinds. The fields were tawny with the uncleared-off stubble, or emerald green with the growth of the aftermath. The roadside cottage gardens were gay with hollyhocks, and Michaelmas daisies and marigolds, and the bright panes of the windows glittered through a veil of China roses. The war was a popular one, and as a natural consequence, soldiers and sailors were heroes everywhere. Philip's long drooping form, his arm hung in a sling, his face scarred and blackened, his jaw bound up with a black silk handkerchief, these marks of active service were reverenced by the rustic cottagers as though they had been crowns and sceptres. Many a hard-handed labourer left his seat by the chimney corner and came to his door to have a look at one who had been fighting the French, and pushed forward to have a grasp of the stranger's hand as he gave back the empty cup into the good wife's keeping, for the kind homely women were ever ready with milk or home-brewed to slake the feverish traveller's thirst when he stopped at their doors and asked for a drink of water. At the village public-house he had a welcome of a more interested character, for the landlord knew full well that his circle of customers would be large that night, if it was only known that he had within his doors a soldier or sailor who had seen service. The rustic politicians would gather round Philip and smoke and drink, and then question and discuss till they were drowsy again. And in their sturdy, obtuse minds they set down the extra glass and the supernumerary pipe to the score of patriotism. Altogether human nature turned its sunny side out to Philip just now, and not before he needed the warmth of brotherly kindness to cheer his shivering soul. Day after day he drifted northwards, making but the slow progress of a feeble man. And yet this short daily walk tired him so much that he longed for rest, for the morning to come when he needed not to feel that in the course of an hour or two he must be up and away. He was toiling on with this longing at his heart, when he saw that he was drawing near a stately city, with a great old cathedral in the centre keeping solemn guard. This place might be yet 2 or 3 miles distant. He was on a rising ground looking down upon it. A labouring man passing by observed his pallid looks and his languid attitude, and told him for his comfort that if he turned down a lane to the left a few steps farther on, he would find himself at the hospital of St. Sepulchre, where bread and beer were given to all comers, and where he might sit him down and rest awhile on the old stone benches within the shadow of the gateway. Obeying these directions, Philip came upon a building which dated from the time of Henry V. Some knight who had fought in the French wars of that time, and had survived his battle and come home to his old halls, had been stirred up by his conscience, or by what was equivalent in those days, his confessor, to build and endow a hospital for 12 decayed soldiers, and a chapel wherein they were to attend the daily masses he ordained to be said till the end of all time, which eternity lasted rather more than a century, pretty well for an eternity bespoken by a man, for his soul and the souls of all whom he had slain. There was a large division of the quadrangular building set apart for the priest, who was to say these masses, and to watch over the well-being of the beadsmen. In process of years, the origin and primary purpose of the hospital had been forgotten by all excepting the local antiquaries, and the place itself came to be regarded as a very pleasant, quaint set of almshouses, and the warden's office, he who should have said or sung his daily masses was now called the warden, and read daily prayers and preached a sermon on Sundays, an agreeable sinecure. Another legacy of old Sir Simon Bray was that of a small croft of land, the rent or profits of which were to go towards giving to all those who asked for it a manchet of bread and a cup of good beer. This beer was, so Sir Simon ordained, to be made after a certain receipt which he left, in which ground ivy took the place of hops, but the receipt, as well as the masses, was modernized according to the progress of time. Philip stood under a great broad stone archway. The back door into the warden's house was on the right side. A kind of buttery hatch was placed by the porter's door on the opposite side. After some consideration, Philip knocked at the closed shutter, and the signal seemed to be well understood. He heard a movement within, the hatch was drawn aside, and his bread and beer were handed to him by a pleasant-looking old man, who proved himself not at all disinclined for conversation. "You may sit down on yonder bench," said he. "Nay, man, sit in the sun, for it's a chilly place, this, and then you can look through the grate and watch the old fellows toddling about in the quad." Philip sat down where the warm October sun slanted upon him, and looked through the iron railing at the peaceful sight. A great square of velvet lawn, intersected diagonally with broad flag-paved walks, the same kind of walk going all round the quadrangle, low 2-storied brick houses, tinted grey and yellow by age, and in many places almost covered with vines, Virginia creepers, and monthly roses. Before each house a little plot of garden ground, bright with flowers, and evidently tended with the utmost care. On the farther side the massive chapel, here and there an old or infirm man sunning himself, or leisurely doing a bit of gardening, or talking to one of his comrades. The place looked as if care and want and even sorrow were locked out and excluded by the ponderous gates through which Philip was gazing. "It's a nice place, bean't it?" said the porter, interpreting Philip's looks pretty accurately. "Leastways, for them as likes it. I've got a bit weary on it myself. It's so far from the world, as a man may say. Not a decent public within a mile and a half, where one can hear a bit of news of an evening." "I think I could make myself very content here," replied Philip. "That's to say, if one were easy in one's mind." "Ay, ay, my man, that's it everywhere. Why, I don't think that I could enjoy myself, not even at the White Hart, where they give you as good a glass of ale for 2pence as anywhere in the 4 kingdoms. I couldn't, to say, flavour my ale even there, if my old woman lay a-dying, which is a sign as it's the heart and not the ale as makes the drink." Just then the warden's back door opened, and out came the warden himself, dressed in full clerical costume. He was going into the neighbouring city, but he stopped to speak to Philip, the wounded soldier, and all the more readily because his old faded uniform told the warden's experienced eye that he had belonged to the Marines. "I hope you enjoy the victual provided for you by the founder of St. Sepulchre," he said kindly. "You look but poorly, my good fellow, and as if a slice of good cold meat would help your bread down." "Thank you, sir," said Philip. "I'm not hungry, only weary, and glad of a draught of beer." "You've been in the Marines, I see. Where have you been serving?" "I was at the siege of Acre last May, sir." At Acre, were you indeed? Then perhaps you know my boy Harry. He was in the blank. It was my company, said Philip, warming up a little. Looking back upon his soldier's life, it seemed to him to have many charms, because it was so full of small daily interests. Then did you know my son, Lieutenant Pennington? It was he that gave me this cloak, sir, when they were sending me back to England. I had been his servant for a short time before I was wounded by the explosion on board the Theseus, and he said I should feel the cold of the voyage. He's very kind, and I've heard say he promises to be a first-rate officer. You shall have a slice of roast beef, whether you want it or not, said the warden, ringing the bell at his own back door. I recognise the cloak now, the young scamp. How soon he's made it shabby, though, he continued, taking up a corner where there was an immense tear not too well botched up. And so you were on board the Theseus at the time of the explosion. Bring some cold meat here for the good man. Or, stay, come in with me, and then you can tell Mrs. Pennington and the young ladies all you know about Harry, and the siege and the explosion. So Philip was ushered into the warden's house, and made to eat roast beef almost against his will. And he was questioned and cross-questioned by 3 eager ladies, all at the same time as it seemed to him. He had given all possible details on the subjects about which they were curious, and was beginning to consider how he could best make his retreat, when the younger Miss Pennington went up to her father, who had all this time stood with his hat on, holding his coat-tails over his arms, with his back to the fire. He bent his ear down a very little to hear some whispered suggestion of his daughter's, nodded his head, and then went on questioning Philip with kindly inquisitiveness and patronage, as the rich do question the poor. And where are you going now? Philip did not answer directly. He wondered in his own mind where he was going. At length he said, Northwards, I believe, but perhaps I shall never reach there. Haven't you friends? Aren't you going to them? There was again a pause. A cloud came over Philip's countenance. He said, No, I'm not going to my friends. I don't know that I've got any left. They interpreted his looks and this speech to mean that he had either lost his friends by death or offended them by enlisting. The warden went on. I ask because we've got a cottage vacant in the mead. Old Dobson, who was with General Wolfe at the taking of Quebec, died a fortnight ago. With such injuries as yours, I fear you'll never be able to work again. But we require strict testimonials as to character, he added, with as penetrating a look as he could summon up at Philip. Philip looked unmoved, either by the offer of the cottage, or the allusion to the possibility of his character not being satisfactory. He was grateful enough, in reality, but too heavy at heart to care very much what became of him. The warden and his family, who were accustomed to consider a settlement at St. Sepulchre's as a sum of all good to a worn-out soldier, were a little annoyed at Philip's cool way of receiving the proposition. The warden went on to name the contingent advantages. Besides the cottage, you would have a load of wood for firing on All Saints, on Christmas, and on Candlemas days, a blue gown and suit of clothes to match every Michaelmas, and a shilling a day to keep yourself in all other things. Your dinner you would have with the other men, in hall. The warden himself goes into hall every day, and sees that everything is comfortable, and says grace, added the warden's lady. I know I seem stupid, said Philip, almost humbly, not to be more grateful, for it's far beyond whatever I expected or thought for again. And it's a great temptation, for I'm just worn out with fatigue. Several times I've thought I must lie down under a hedge and just die for very weariness. But once I had a wife and a child up in the north. He stopped. And are they dead? Asked one of the young ladies in a soft, sympathizing tone. Her eyes met Philip's, full of dumb woe. He tried to speak. He wanted to explain more fully, yet not to reveal the truth. Well, said the warden, thinking he perceived the real state of things, what I propose is this. You shall go into old Dobson's house at once, as a kind of probationary bedesman. I'll write to Harry and get your character from him. Stephen Freeman, I think you said your name was. Before I can receive his reply, you'll have been able to tell how you'd like the kind of life, and at any rate you'll have a rest you seem to require in the meantime. You see, I take Harry's having given you that cloak as a kind of character, added he, smiling kindly. Of course, you'll have to conform to rules just like all the rest. Chapel at 8, dinner at 12, lights out at 9. But I'll tell you the remainder of our regulations as we walk across the quad to your new quarters. And thus Philip, almost in spite of himself, became installed in a bedesman's house at St. Sepulchre. End of chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 42. A Fable at Fault. Philip took possession of the 2 rooms which had belonged to the dead Sergeant Dobson. They were furnished sufficiently for every comfort by the trustees of the hospital. Some little fragments of ornament, some small articles picked up in distant countries, a few tattered books, remained in the room as legacies from their former occupant. At first the repose of the life and the place was inexpressibly grateful to Philip. He had always shrunk from encountering strangers, and displaying his blackened and scarred countenance to them, even where such disfigurement was most regarded as a mark of honour. In St Sepulchre's he met none but the same set day after day, and when he had once told the tale of how it had happened and submitted to their gaze, it was over for ever, if he so minded. The slight employment his garden gave him, there was a kitchen garden behind each house, as well as the flower plot in front, and the daily arrangement of his parlour and chamber were, at the beginning of his time of occupation, as much bodily labour as he could manage. There was something stately and utterly removed from all Philip's previous existence in the forms observed at every day's dinner, when the 12 bedesmen met in a large quaint hall, and the warden came in his college cap and gown to say the long Latin grace which wound up with something very like a prayer for the soul of Sir Simon Bray. It took some time to get a reply to ship letters in those times, when no one could exactly say where the fleet might be found. And before Dr. Pennington had received the excellent character of Stephen Freeman, which his son gladly sent in answer to his father's inquiries, Philip had become restless and uneasy in the midst of all this peace and comfort. Sitting alone over his fire in the long winter evenings, the scenes of his past life rose before him, his childhood, his Aunt Robson's care of him, his first going to Foster's shop in Monkshaven, Haytersbank Farm, and the spelling lessons in the bright warm kitchen there, Kinraid's appearance, the miserable night of the Corneys' party, the farewell he had witnessed on Monkshaven sand, the press gang, and all the long consequences of that act of concealment, poor Daniel Robson's trial and execution, his own marriage, his child's birth. And then he came to that last day at Monkshaven, and he went over and over again the torturing details, the looks of contempt and anger, the words of loathing and indignation, till he almost brought himself, out of his extreme sympathy with Sylvia, to believe that he was indeed the wretch she had considered him to be. He forgot his own excuses for having acted as he had done, though these excuses had at one time seemed to him to wear the garb of reasons. After long thought and bitter memory came some wonder. What was Sylvia doing now? Where was she? What was his child like? His child as well as hers. And then he remembered the poor footsore wife and the little girl she carried in her arms, that was just the age of Bella. He wished he had noticed that child more, that a clear vision of it might rise up when he wanted to picture Bella. One night he had gone round this mill-wheel circle of ideas till he was weary to the very marrow of his bones. To shake off the monotonous impression, he rose to look for a book amongst the old tattered volumes, hoping that he might find something that would sufficiently lay hold of him to change the current of his thoughts. There was an old volume of Peregrine Pickle, a book of sermons, half an army list of 1774, and the 7 Champions of Christendom. Philip took up this last, which he had never seen before. In it he read how Sir Guy, Earl of Warwick, went to fight the Paynim in his own country, and was away for 7 long years. And when he came back, his own wife, Phyllis, the countess in her castle, did not know the poor travel-worn hermit who came daily to seek his dole of bread at her hands, along with many beggars and such poor. But at last, when he lay a-dying in his cave in the rock, he sent for her by a secret sign known but to them twain. And she came with great speed, for she knew it was her lord who had sent for her. And they had many sweet and holy words together before he gave up the ghost, his head lying on her bosom. The old story, known to most people from their childhood, was all new and fresh to Philip. He did not quite believe in the truth of it, because the fictitious nature of the histories of some of the other champions of Christendom was too patent. But he could not help thinking that this one might be true, and that Guy and Phyllis might have been as real flesh and blood long, long ago as he and Sylvia had even been. The old room, the quiet moonlit quadrangle into which the cross-barred casement looked, the quaint aspect of everything that he had seen for weeks and weeks, All this predisposed Philip to dwell upon the story he had just been reading as a faithful legend of two lovers whose bones were long since dust. He thought that if he could thus see Sylvia, himself unknown, unseen, could live at her gates, so to speak, and gaze upon her and his child, some day, too, when he lay a-dying, he might send for her, and in soft words of mutual forgiveness breathe his life away in her arms. Or, perhaps, and so he lost himself, and from thinking passed on to dreaming. All night long Guy and Phyllis, Sylvia and his child, passed in and out of his visions. It was impossible to make the fragments of his dreams cohere, but the impression made upon him by them was not the less strong for this. He felt as if he were called to Monkshaven, wanted at Monkshaven, and to Monkshaven he resolved to go, although when his reason overtook his feelings, he knew perfectly how unwise it was to leave a home of peace and tranquillity and surrounding friendliness to go to a place where nothing but want and wretchedness awaited him, unless he made himself known, and if he did, a deeper want, a more woeful wretchedness would in all probability be his portion. In the small oblong of looking-glass hung against the wall, Philip caught the reflection of his own face, and laughed scornfully at the sight. The thin hair lay upon his temples in the flakes that betokened long ill health. His eyes were the same as ever, and they had always been considered the best feature in his face, but they were sunk in their orbits, and looked hollow and gloomy. As for the lower part of his face, blackened, contracted, drawn away from his teeth, the outline entirely changed by the breakage of his jawbone, he was indeed a fool if he thought himself fit to go forth to win back that love which Sylvia had forsworn. As a hermit and a beggar, he must return to Monkshaven and fall perforce into the same position which Guy of Warwick had only assumed. But still he should see his Phyllis, and might feast his sad hopeless eyes from time to time with the sight of his child. His small pension of 6d. a day would keep him from absolute want of necessaries. So that very day he went to the warden and told him he thought of giving up his share in the bequest of Sir Simon Bray. Such a relinquishment had never occurred before in all the warden's experience, and he was very much inclined to be offended. I must say that for a man not to be satisfied as a bedesman of St Sepulchre's argues a very wrong state of mind, and a very ungrateful heart. I'm sure, sir, it's not from any ingratitude, for I can hardly feel thankful to you and to Simon, and to madam, and the young ladies, and all my comrades in the hospital, and I never expect to be either so comfortable or so peaceful again. But what can you have to say against this place, then? Not but there are always plenty of applicants for every vacancy. Only I thought I was doing a kindness to a man out of Harry's company. And you'll not see Harry either. He's got his leave in March. I'm very sorry. I should like to have seen the lieutenant again. But I cannot rest any longer so far away from people I once knew. 10 to 1 they're dead, or removed, or something or other by this time, and it'll serve you right if they are. Mind, no one can be chosen twice to be a bedesman of St Sepulchre's. The warden turned away, and Philip, uneasy at staying, disheartened at leaving, went to make his few preparations for setting out once more on his journey northwards. He had to give notice of his change of residence to the local distributor of pensions, and 1 or 2 farewells had to be taken, with more than usual sadness at the necessity, for Philip, under his name of Stephen Freeman, had attached some of the older bedesmen a good deal to him, from his unselfishness, his willingness to read to them, and to render them many little services, and perhaps as much as anything, by his habitual silence, which made him a convenient recipient of all their garrulousness. So before the time for his departure came, he had the opportunity of one more interview with the warden, of a more friendly character than that in which he gave up his bedesmanship. And so far it was well, and Philip turned his back upon St Sepulchre's, with his sore heart partly healed by his 4 months' residence there. He was stronger, too, in body, more capable of the day-after-day walks that were required of him. He had saved some money from his allowance as bedesman and from his pension, and might occasionally have taken an outside place on a coach, had it not been that he shrank from the first look of every stranger upon his disfigured face. Yet the gentle, wistful eyes and the white and faultless teeth always did away with the first impression, as soon as people became a little acquainted with his appearance. It was February when Philip left St Sepulchre's. It was the first week in April when he began to recognise the familiar objects between York and Monkshaven, and now he began to hang back, and to question the wisdom of what he had done, just as the warden had prophesied that he would. The last night of his 200-mile walk he slept at the little inn at which he had been enlisted nearly 2 years before. It was by no intention of his that he rested at that identical place. Night was drawing on, and in making as he thought a short-cut, he had missed his way, and was fain to seek shelter where he might find it. But it brought him very straight face to face with his life at that time, and ever since. His mad, wild hopes, half the result of intoxication, as he now knew, all dead and gone. The career then freshly opening, shut up against him now. His youthful strength and health changed into premature infirmity, and the home and the love that should have opened wide its doors to console him for all, why, in 2 years death might have been busy, and taken away from him his last feeble chance of the faint happiness of seeing his beloved without being seen or known of her. All that night and all the next day, the fear of Sylvia's possible death overclouded his heart. It was strange that he had hardly ever thought of this before. So strange that now, when the terror came, it took possession of him, and he could almost have sworn that she must be lying dead in Monkshaven churchyard. Or was it little Bella, that blooming lovely babe whom he was never to see again? There was the tolling of mournful bells in the distant air to his disturbed fancy, and the cry of the happy birds, the plaintive bleating of the new-dropped lambs, were all omens of evil import to him. As well as he could, he found his way back to Monkshaven, over the wild heights and moors he had crossed on that black day of misery. Why he should have chosen that path he could not tell. It was as if he were led, and had no free will of his own. The soft, clear evening was drawing on, and his heart beat thick and then stopped, only to start again with fresh violence. There he was, at the top of the long, steep lane that was in some parts a literal staircase leading down from the hilltop into the High Street, through the very entry up which he had passed when he shrank away from his former and his then present life. There he stood, looking down once more at the numerous irregular roofs, the many stacks of chimneys below him, seeking out that which had once been his own dwelling. Who dwelt there now? The yellow gleams grew narrower, the evening shadows broader, and Philip crept down the lane a weary, woeful man. At every gap in the close-packed buildings he heard the merry music of a band, the cheerful sound of excited voices. Still he descended slowly, scarcely wondering what it could be, for it was not associated in his mind with the one pervading thought of Sylvia. When he came to the angle of junction between the lane and the High Street, he seemed plunged all at once into the very centre of the bustle, and he drew himself up into a corner of deep shadow, from whence he could look out upon the street. A circus was making its grand entry into Monkshaven, with all the pomp of colour and of noise that it could muster. Trumpeters in parti-coloured clothes rode first, blaring out triumphant discord. Next came a gold and scarlet chariot, drawn by 6 piebald horses, and the windings of this team through the tortuous narrow street were pretty enough to look upon. In the chariot sat kings and queens, heroes and heroines, or what were meant for such. All the little boys and girls running alongside of the chariot envied them, but they themselves were very much tired and shivering with cold in their heroic pomp of classic clothing. All this Philip might have seen, did see in fact, but heeded not one jot. Almost opposite to him, not 10 yards apart, standing on the raised step at the well-known shop door, was Sylvia, holding a child, a merry dancing child, up in her arms to see the show. She too, Sylvia, was laughing for pleasure, and for sympathy with pleasure. She held the little Bella aloft that the child might see the gaudy procession the better and the longer, looking at it herself with red lips apart and white teeth glancing through. Then she turned to speak to someone behind her. Coulson, as Philip saw the moment afterwards. His answer made her laugh once again. Philip saw it all, her bonny, careless looks, her pretty matronly form, her evident ease of mind and prosperous outward circumstances. The years that he had spent in gloomy sorrow amongst wild scenes on land or by sea, his life in frequent peril of a bloody end, had gone by with her like sunny days, all the more sunny because he was not there. So bitterly thought the poor disabled marine as, weary and despairing, he stood in the cold shadow and looked upon the home that should have been his haven, the wife that should have welcomed him, the child that should have been his comfort. He had banished himself from his home. His wife had forsworn him. His child was blossoming into intelligence unwitting of any father. Wife and child and home were all doing well without him. What madness had tempted him thither? An hour ago, like a fanciful fool, he had thought she might be dead. Dead with sad penitence for her cruel words at her heart, with mournful wonder at the unaccounted-for absence of her child's father preying on her spirits, and in some measure causing the death he had apprehended. but to look at her there where she stood, it did not seem as if she had had an hour's painful thought in all her blooming life. Ay, go into the warm hearth, mother and child, now the gay cavalcade has gone out of sight, and the chill of night has succeeded to the sun's setting. Husband and father, steal out into the cold dark street, and seek some poor cheap lodging where you may rest your weary bones, and cheat your more weary heart into forgetfulness in sleep. The pretty story of the Countess Phyllis, who mourned for her husband's absence so long, is a fable of old times. Or rather say Earl Guy never wedded his wife, knowing that one she loved better than him was alive all the time she had believed him to be dead. End of chapter 42.
Chapter 43 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 43. The Unknown. A few days before that on which Philip arrived at Monkshaven, Kester had come to pay Sylvia a visit. As the earliest friend she had, and also as one who knew the real secrets of her life, Sylvia always gave him the warm welcome, the cordial words, and the sweet looks in which the old man delighted. He had a sort of delicacy of his own, which kept him from going to see her too often, even when he was stationary at Monkshaven. But he looked forward to the times when he allowed himself this pleasure, as a child at school looks forward to its holidays. The time of his service at Haytersbank had, on the whole, been the happiest in all his long monotonous years of daily labour. Sylvia's father had always treated him with the rough kindness of fellowship. Sylvia's mother had never stinted him in his meat or grudged him his share of the best that was going, and once, when he was ill for a few days, in the loft above the cow-house, she had made him possets, and nursed him with the same tenderness which he remembered his mother showing to him when he was a little child, but which he had never experienced since then. He had known Sylvia herself as bud and sweet promise of blossom, and just as she was opening into the full-blown rose, and, if she had been happy and prosperous, might have passed out of the narrow circle of Kester's interests. One sorrow after another came down upon her pretty innocent head, and Kester's period of service to Daniel Robson, her father, was tragically cut short. All this made Sylvia the great centre of the faithful herdsman's affection, and Bella, who reminded him of what Sylvia was when first Kester knew her, only occupied the second place in his heart, although to the child he was much more demonstrative of his regard than to the mother. He had dressed himself in his Sunday best, and although it was only Thursday, had forestalled his Saturday's shaving. He had provided himself with a paper of humbugs for the child, humbugs being the North Country term for certain lumps of toffee, well flavoured with peppermint, and now he sat in the accustomed chair, as near to the door as might be, in Sylvia's presence, coaxing the little one, who was not quite sure of his identity, to come to him, by opening the paper parcel, and letting its sweet contents be seen. "She's like thee, and yet she favours her feyther," said he. And the moment he had uttered the incautious words, he looked up to see how Sylvia had taken the unpremeditated, unusual reference to her husband. His stealthy glance did not meet her eye, but though he thought she had coloured a little, she did not seem offended as he had feared. It was true that Bella had her father's grave, thoughtful, dark eyes, instead of her mother's grey ones, out of which the childlike expression of wonder would never entirely pass away. And as Bella slowly and half distrustfully made her way towards the temptation offered her, she looked at Kester with just her father's look. Sylvia said nothing in direct reply. Kester almost thought she could not have heard him, but by and by she said, "You'll have heard how Kinraid, who's a captain now, and a grand officer, has gone and got married." "Nay," said Kester in genuine surprise, "he never has, for sure." "Ay, but he has," said Sylvia, "and I'm sure I do not see why he shouldn't." "Well, well," said Kester, not looking up at her, for he caught the inflections in the tones of her voice. "He were a fine stirring chap, yon, and he were allus for doing summat. And when he fund as he couldn't have one thing as he'd set his mind on, I reckon he thought he mun put up wi' another." "It 'ud be no putting up," said Sylvia. "She were staying at Bessie Dawson's, and she come here to see me. She's as pretty a young lady as you'd see in a summer's day, and a real lady too, with a fortune. She didn't speak 2 words without bringing in her husband's name, the captain, as she called him." "And she come to see thee?" said Kester, cocking his eye at Sylvia with the old shrewd look. "That was summat queer, weren't it?" Sylvia reddened a good deal. "He's too fause to have spoken to her on me in t' old way, as he used for to speak to me. I were nought to her but Philip's wife." "And what t' dickens had she to do wi' Philip?" asked Kester, in intense surprise, and so absorbed in curiosity that he let the humbugs all fall out of the paper upon the floor, and the little Bella sat down, plump, in the midst of treasures as great as those fabled to exist on Tom Tiddler's ground. Sylvia was again silent, but Kester, knowing her well, was sure that she was struggling to speak, and bided his time without repeating his question. "She said, and I think her tale were true, though I cannot get to t' rights on it, think on it as I will, as Philip saved her husband's life somewhere nearabouts to Jerusalem. She would have it that t' captain, for I think I'll niver call him Kinraid again, was in great battle, and were near upon being shot by t' French, when Philip, our Philip, come up and went right into the fire of the guns and saved her husband's life, and she spoke as if both she and the captain were more beholden to Philip than words could tell, and she come to see me to try and get news on him." "It's a queer kind of story," said Kester, meditatively. "I should ha' thought as Philip were more likely to ha' given him a shove into the thick on it than to help him out of the scrape." "Nay," said Sylvia, suddenly looking straight at Kester, "you're out there. Philip had a deal of good in him, and I do not think as he'd ha' gone and married another woman so soon, if he'd ha' been in Kinraid's place." "And you've niver heerd on Philip sin' he left?" asked Kester, after a while. "Niver. Not but what she told me. And she said that t' captain made inquiry for him right and left, as soon after that happened as might be, and could hear niver word about him. No one had seen him, or knowed his name." "You never heerd of his going for to be a soldier?" persevered Kester. "Niver. I told you once, it were unlike Philip to think o' such a thing." "But thou mun ha' been thinking on him at times in a' these years, bad as he behaved hissel. He were t' feyther of thy little one. What did ta think he had been agate on when he left here?" "I didn't know. I were none so keen o' thinking on him at first. I tried to put him out of my thoughts altogether, for it made me like mad to think how he'd stood between me and that other. But I begun to wonder about him, and to think I should like to hear as he were doing well. I reckon I thought he were in London, where he'd been that time afore, you know, and had always spoke as if he'd enjoyed hissel, tolerable. And then Molly Brunton told me on t'other one's marriage, and somehow it gave me a shake in my heart, and I began for to wish I hadn't said all them words in my passion. And then that fine young lady come wi' her story, and I've thought a deal on it since, and my mind has come out clear. Philip's dead, and it were his spirit as come to t'other's help in his time o' need. I've heard feyther say as spirits cannot rest in their graves for trying to undo the wrongs they've done in their bodies." "Them's my conclusions," said Kester, solemnly. "I was fain for to hear what were your judgments first, but them's the conclusions I come to as soon as I heard the tale." "Let alone that one thing," said Sylvia. "He were a good kind man." "It were a big deal on a one thing, though," said Kester. "It just spoilt your life, my poor lass, and might ha' gone near to spoiling Charlie Kinraid's too." "Men takes a deal more nor women to spoil their lives," said Sylvia, bitterly. "Not a make o' men. I reckon, lass, Philip's life were pretty well on for being spoilt at after he left here, and it were, maybe, a good thing he got rid on it so soon." "I wish I'd just had a few kind words wi' him, I do," said Sylvia, almost on the point of crying. "Come, lass, it's as ill moaning after what's past as it 'ud be for me to fill my eyes wi' weeping after the humbugs as this little wench o' thine has grubbed up whilst we'n been talking, while there's not one on 'em left." "She's a sad spoilt little puss," said Sylvia, holding out her arms to the child, who ran into them, and began patting her mother's cheeks, and pulling at the soft brown curls tucked away beneath the matronly cap. "Mammy spoils her, and Hester spoils her." "Granny Rose doesn't spoil me," said the child, with a quick, intelligent discrimination, interrupting her mother's list. "No, but Jeremiah Foster does above a bit. He'll come in from t' bank, Kester, and ask for her a'most every day, and he'll bring her things in his pocket, and she's so fause she allays goes straight to peep in, and then he shifts t'apple or t' toy into another. But she's a little fause one," half devouring the child with her kisses, "and he comes and takes her walk, oftentimes, and he goes as slow as if he were quite an old man, to keep pace with Bella's steps. I often run upstairs and watch him out of the window. He doesn't care to have me with him. He's so fain to have the child all to hisself." "She's a bonny un for sure," said Kester, "but not so pretty as thou was, Sylvie. I've never telled thee what I come for, though, and it's about time for me to be going. I'm off to Cheviot's to-morrow morning to fetch home some sheep as Jonas Blundell has purchased. It'll be a job o' better nor 2 months, I reckon." "It'll be a nice time o' year," said Sylvia, a little surprised at Kester's evident discouragement at the prospect of the journey or absence. He had often been away from Monkshaven for a longer time without seeming to care so much about it. "Well, yo see, it's a bit hard upon me for to leave my sister, she as is to widow woman, where I put up when I'm at home. Things is main and dear, 4 pound loaves is at 16 pence, and there's a deal o' talk on a famine into land, and whatten a paid for my victual and to bed, and to lean to helped t'oud woman a bit. And she's sadly down into mouth, for she cannot hear on a lodger for to take my place, for she's moved o'er to other side o' t' bridge for to be nearer to new buildings. And t' grand new walk they're making round t' cliffs, thinking she'd be likelier to pick up a labourer as would be glad on a bed near his work. I'd ha' liked to ha' set her a gate with a sponsible lodger before I'd ha' left, for she's just so soft-hearted, any scamp may put upon her, if he nobbut gets howd on her blind side." "Can I help her?" said Sylvia in her eager way. "I should be so glad, and I've a deal of money by me." "Nay, my lass," said Kester, "thou munnot go off so fast. It were just what I feared on in telling thee. I've left her a bit of money, and I'll make shift to send her more. It's just a kind word to keep up her heart when I'm gone as I want. If thou'd step in and see her fra time to time, and cheer her up a bit wi' talking to her on me, I'd take it very kind, and I'd go off with a lighter heart." "Then I'm sure I'll do it for you, Kester. I never justly felt like mysel' when you're away, for I'm lonesome enough at times. She and I will talk all to better about you, for both on us grieving after you." So Kester took his leave, his mind set at ease by Sylvia's promise to go and see his sister pretty often during his absence in the north. But Sylvia's habits were changed since she, as a girl at Haytersbank, liked to spend half her time in the open air, running out perpetually without anything on to scatter crumbs to the poultry, or to take a piece of bread to the old cart horse, to go up to the garden for a handful of herbs, or to clamber to the highest point around to blow the horn which summoned her father and Kester home to dinner. Living in a town where it was necessary to put on hat and cloak before going out into the street, and then to walk in a steady and decorous fashion, she had only cared to escape down to the freedom of the seashore until Philip went away. And after that time she had learnt so to fear observation as a deserted wife, that nothing but Bella's health would have been a sufficient motive to take her out of doors. And as she had told Kester, the necessity of giving the little girl a daily walk was very much lightened by the great love and affection which Jeremiah Foster now bore to the child. Ever since the day when the baby had come to his knee, allured by the temptation of his watch, he had apparently considered her as in some sort belonging to him. And now he had almost come to think that he had a right to claim her as his companion in his walk back from the bank to his early dinner, where a high chair was always placed ready for the chance of her coming to share his meal. On these occasions he generally brought her back to the shop door when he returned to his afternoon's work at the bank. Sometimes, however, he would leave word that she was to be sent for from his house in the new town, as his business at the bank for that day was ended. Then Sylvia was compelled to put on her things and fetch back her darling, and excepting for this errand she seldom went out at all on weekdays. About a fortnight after Kester's farewell call, this need for her visit to Jeremiah Foster's arose, and it seemed to Sylvia that there could not be a better opportunity of fulfilling her promise and going to see the widow Dobson, whose cottage was on the other side of the river, low down on the cliff side, just at the bend and rush of the full stream into the open sea. She set off pretty early in order to go there first. She found the widow with her house place tidied up after the midday meal, and busy knitting at the open door, not looking at her rapid clicking needles, but gazing at the rush and recession of the waves before her, yet not seeing them either, rather seeing days long past. She started into active civility as soon as she recognized Sylvia, who was to her as a great lady, never having known Sylvia Robson in her wild childish days. Widow Dobson was always a little scandalized at her brother Christopher's familiarity with Mrs. Hepburn. She dusted a chair which needed no dusting, and placed it for Sylvia, sitting down herself on a three-legged stool to mark her sense of the difference in their conditions, for there was another chair or two in the humble dwelling. And then the two fell in to talk, first about Kester, whom his sister would persist in calling Christopher, as if his dignity as her elder brother was compromised by any familiar abbreviation, and by she opened her heart a little more. "I could wish as I'd learned right of hand," said she, "for I've that for to tell Christopher as might set his mind at ease. But, you see, if I wrote him a letter, he couldn't read it. So I just comfort mysel' with thinking nobody need learn writing unless they'n got friends as can read. But I reckon he'd ha' been glad to hear as I've getten a lodger." Here she nodded her head in the direction of the door opening out of the house-place into the lean-to, which Sylvia had observed on drawing near the cottage, and the recollection of the mention of which by Kester had enabled her to identify Widow Dobson's dwelling. "He's a bed yonder," the latter continued, dropping her voice. "He's a queer-looking tyke, but I don't think as he's a bad un." "When did he come?" said Sylvia, remembering Kester's account of his sister's character, and feeling as though it behoved her, as Kester's confidant on this head, to give cautious and prudent advice. A matter of a sennight ago. I'm noan good at minding time. He's paid me his rent twice, but then he were keen to pay aforehand. He'd comed in one night, and sate him down afore he could speak. He were so done up. He'd been on tramp this many a day, I reckon. "Can you give me a bed?" says he, panting, like, after a bit. "A chap as I met near here says as you've got a lodging for to let." "Ay," says I ha' that, but you mun pay me a shilling a week for it." Then my mind misgive me, for I thought he hadn't a shilling in t' world, and yet if he hadn't, I should just ha' gi'en him to bed a' t' same. I'm not one as can turn a dog out if he comes to me wearied o' his life. So he outs wi' a shilling, and lays it down on t' table 'bout a word. "I'll not trouble you long," says he. "I'm one as is best out o' t' world," he says. Then I thought as I'd been a bit hard upon him, and says I, "I'm a widow woman, and one as has getten but few friends." For you see I were low about our Christopher's going away north, so I'm forced like to speak hard to folk. But I've made myself some stirabout for my supper, and if you'd like to share and share about wi' me, it's but putting a sup more water to it, and God's blessing 'll be on it, just as same as if 'twere meal." So he ups wi' his hand afore his eyen, and says not a word. At last he says, "Missus," says he, "can God's blessing be shared by a sinner? One o' t' devil's children," says he, "for t' scripture says he's t' father o' lies." So I were puzzled like, and at length I says, "Thou mun ask t' parson that. I'm but a poor faint-hearted widow woman, but I've allays had God's blessing somehow. Now I bethink me, and I'll share it with thee as far as my will goes." So he rakes his hand across the table, and mutters summat as he grips mine. I thought it were scripture as he said, but I'd need all my strength just then for to lift a pot off t' fire. It were t' first victual I'd tasted since morn, for t' famine comes down like stones on t' head o' us poor folk. And all I said were just, "Come along, chap, and fa too, and God's blessing be on him as eats most." And sin' that day him and me's been as thick as thieves, only he's niver telled me nought of who he is or where he comes from. But I think he's one o' them poor colliers as has getten brunt into coal pits, for to be sure his face is all black wi' fire marks, and o' late days he's ta'en to his bed, and just lies there sighing, for one can hear him plain as daylight through t' bit o' partition way. As proof of this, a sigh, almost a groan, startled the two women at this very moment. "Poor fellow!" said Sylvia in a soft whisper. "There's more sore hearts in t' world than one reckons for." But after a while she bethought her again of Kester's account of his sister's softness, and she thought that it behoved her to give some good advice. So she added in a sterner, harder tone, "Still, you say you know nought about him, and tramps is tramps all t' world over, and you're a widow, and it behoves you to be careful. I think I'd just send him off as soon as he's a bit rested. You say he's plenty o' money." "Nay, I never said that. I know nought about it. He pays me aforehand, and he pays me down for whatever I've a getten for him. But that's but little. He's noan up to his victual, though I've made him some broth as good as I could make him." "I wouldn't send him away till he was well again if I were you, but I think you'd better be rid on him," said Sylvia. "It would be different if your brother were in Monkshaven." As she spoke she rose to go. Widow Dobson held her hand in hers for a minute, and then the humble woman said, "You'll noan be vexed wi' me, missus, if I cannot find in my heart to turn him out till he wants to go hissel, for I wouldn't like to vex you for Christopher's sake, but I know what it is for to feel for friendless folk, and choose what may come on it. I cannot send him away." "No," said Sylvia. "Why should I be vexed? It's no business o' mine. Only I should send him away, if I was you. He might go lodge where there was men folk, who know t' ways o' tramps, and are up to them." Into the sunshine went Sylvia. In the cold shadow the miserable tramp lay sighing. She did not know that she had been so near to him towards whom her heart was softening, day by day. End of chapter 43.
Chapter 44 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 44. First Words. It was the spring of 1800. Old people yet can tell of the hard famine of that year. The harvest of the autumn before had failed. The war and the corn laws had brought the price of corn up to a famine rate, and much of what came into the market was unsound, and consequently unfit for food, yet hungry creatures bought it eagerly, and tried to cheat disease by mixing the damp, sweet, clammy flour with rice or potato meal. Rich families denied themselves pastry and all unnecessary and luxurious uses of wheat in any shape. The duty on hair powder was increased, and all these palliatives were but as drops in the ocean of the great want of the people. Philip, in spite of himself, recovered and grew stronger. And as he grew stronger, hunger took the place of loathing dislike to food. But his money was all spent, and what was his poor pension of 6d. a day in that terrible year of famine? Many a summer's night he walked for hours and hours round the house which once was his, which might be his now, with all its homely blessed comforts, could he but go and assert his right to it. But to go with authority, and in his poor maimed guise assert that right, he had need be other than Philip Hepburn. So he stood in the old shelter of the steep crooked lane, opening on to the hill out of the market-place, and watched the soft fading of the summer's eve into night, the closing of the once familiar shop, the exit of good comfortable William Coulson, going to his own home, his own wife, his comfortable plentiful supper. Then Philip, there were no police in those days, and scarcely an old watchman in that primitive little town, would go round on the shady sides of streets, and, quickly glancing about him, cross the bridge, looking on the quiet rippling stream, the grey shimmer foretelling the coming dawn over the sea, the black masts and rigging of the still vessels against the sky. He could see with his wistful eager eyes the shape of the windows, the window of the very room in which his wife and child slept unheeding of him, the hungry, broken-hearted outcast. He would go back to his lodging, and softly lift the latch of the door, still more softly, but never without an unspoken grateful prayer, pass by the poor sleeping woman who had given him a shelter and her share of God's blessing, she who, like him, knew not the feeling of satisfied hunger. And then he laid him down on the narrow pallet in the lean-to, and again gave Sylvia happy lessons in the kitchen at Haytersbank, and the dead were alive, and Charlie Kinraid, the specksioneer, had never come to trouble the hopeful gentle peace. For widow Dobson had never taken Sylvia's advice. The tramp known to her by the name of Freeman, that in which he received his pension, lodged with her still, and paid his meagre shilling in advance, weekly. A shilling was meagre in those hard days of scarcity. A hungry man might easily eat the produce of a shilling in a day. Widow Dobson pleaded this to Sylvia as an excuse for keeping her lodger on. To a more calculating head it might have seemed a reason for sending him away. "You see, missus," said she apologetically to Sylvia one evening, as the latter called upon the poor widow before going to fetch little Bella. It was now too hot for the child to cross the bridge in the full heat of the summer sun, and Jeremiah would take her up to her supper instead. "You see, missus, there's not as many as 'ud take him in for a shilling when it goes so little way, or if they did, they'd take it out on him some other way, and he's not getting much else, I reckon. He calls me granny, and I'm vast mistaken if he's the 10 year younger nor me, but he's getting a fine appetite of his own, choose how young he may be, and I can see as he could eat a deal more nor he's getting money to buy, and it's few as can mak' victual go farther nor me. Eh, missus, but you may trust me I'll send him off when times is better, but just now it'll be sending him to his death, for I ha' plenty and to spare, thanks be to God and your bonny face." So Sylvia had to be content with the knowledge that the money she gladly gave to Kester's sister went partly to feed the lodger who was neither labourer nor neighbour, but only just a tramp, who, she feared, was preying on the good old woman. Still, the cruel famine cut sharp enough to penetrate all hearts, and Sylvia, an hour after the conversation recorded above, was much touched on her return from Jeremiah Foster's with the little merry chattering Bella, at seeing the feeble steps of one, whom she knew by description must be widow Dobson's lodger, turn up from the newly cut road which was to lead to the terrace walk around the north cliff, a road which led to no dwelling but widow Dobson's. Tramp and vagrant he might be in the eyes of the law, but, whatever his character, Sylvia could see him before her in the soft dusk, creeping along over the bridge, often stopping to rest and hold by some support, and then going on again towards the town, to which she and happy little Bella were wending. A thought came over her. She had always fancied that this unknown man was some fierce vagabond, and had dreaded lest, in the lonely bit of road between widow Dobson's cottage and the peopled highway, he should fall upon her and rob her, if he learned that she had money with her. And several times she had gone away without leaving the little gift she had intended, because she imagined that she had seen the door of the small chamber in the lean-to open softly while she was there, as if the occupant, whom widow Dobson spoke of as never leaving the house before dusk excepting once a week, were listening for the chink of the coin in her little leathern purse. Now that she saw him walking before her with heavy languid steps, this fear gave place to pity. She remembered her mother's gentle superstition, which had prevented her from ever sending the hungry empty away, for fear lest she herself should come to need bread. "Lassie," said she to little Bella, who held a cake which Jeremiah's housekeeper had given her tight in her hand, "yon poor man theere is hungry. Will Bella give him her cake, and mother will make her another to-morrow twice as big?" For this consideration, and with the feeling of satisfaction which a good supper not an hour ago gives even to the hungry stomach of a child of 3 years old, Bella, after some thought, graciously assented to the sacrifice. Sylvia stopped, the cake in her hand, and turned her back to the town, and to the slow wayfarer in front. Under the cover of her shawl she slipped a half-crown deep into the crumb of the cake, and then restoring it to little Bella, she gave her directions. "Mammy will carry Bella, and when Bella goes past the poor man, she shall give him the cake over Mammy's shoulder. Poor man is so hungry, and Bella and Mammy have plenty to eat and to spare." The child's heart was touched by the idea of hunger, and her little arm was outstretched, ready for the moment her mother's hurried steps took her brushing past the startled, trembling Philip. "Poor man, eat this. Bella not hungry." They were the first words he had ever heard his child utter. The echoes of them rang in his ears as he stood endeavouring to hide his disfigured face by looking over the parapet of the bridge down upon the stream running away towards the ocean, into which his hot tears slowly fell, unheeded by the weeper. Then he changed the intention with which he had set out upon his nightly walk, and turned back to his lodging. Of course the case was different with Sylvia. She would have forgotten the whole affair very speedily, if it had not been for little Bella's frequent recurrence to the story of the hungry man, which had touched her small sympathies with the sense of an intelligible misfortune. She liked to act the dropping of the bun into the poor man's hand as she went past him, and would take up any article near her in order to illustrate the gesture she had used. One day she got hold of Hester's watch for this purpose, as being of the same round shape as the cake, and though Hester, for whose benefit the child was repeating the story in her broken language for the 3rd or 4th time, tried to catch the watch as it was intended that she should, she being the representative of the hungry man for the time being, it went to the ground with a smash that frightened the little girl, and she began to cry at the mischief she had done. "Don't cry, Bella," said Hester. "Niver play wi' watches again. I didn't see thee at mine, or I'd ha' stopped thee in time. But I'll take it to old Darley's on quayside, and maybe he'll soon set it to rights again. Only Bella must never play with watches again." "Niver no more," promised the little sobbing child, and that evening Hester took her watch down to old Darley's. This William Darley was the brother of the gardener at the rectory, the uncle to the sailor who had been shot by the press gang years before, and to his bedridden sister. He was a clever mechanician, and his skill as a repairer of watches and chronometers was great among the sailors, with whom he did a very irregular sort of traffic, conducted, often without much use of money, but rather on the principle of barter, they bringing him foreign coins and odd curiosities picked up on their travels in exchange for his services to their nautical instruments or their watches. If he had ever had capital to extend his business, he might have been a rich man, but it is to be doubted whether he would have been as happy as he was now in his queer little habitation of 2 rooms, the front one being both shop and workshop, the other serving the double purpose of bedroom and museum. The skill of this odd-tempered, shabby old man was sometimes sought by the jeweller who kept the more ostentatious shop in the High Street, but before Darley would undertake any tickle piece of delicate workmanship for the other, he sneered at his ignorance and taunted and abused him well. Yet he had soft places in his heart, and Hester Rose had found her way to one by her patient, enduring kindness to his bedridden niece. He never snarled at her as he did at too many, and on the few occasions when she had asked him to do anything for her, he had seemed as if she were conferring the favour on him, not he on her, and only made the smallest possible charge. She found him now sitting where he could catch the most light for his work, spectacles on nose and microscope in hand. He took her watch and examined it carefully without a word in reply to her. Then he began to open it and take it to pieces in order to ascertain the nature of the mischief. Suddenly he heard her catch her breath with a checked sound of surprise. He looked at her from above his spectacles. She was holding a watch in her hand, which he had just taken up off the counter. "What's amiss with thee now?" said Darley. "Hast ta niver seen a watch o' that mak' afore? Or is it them letters on t' back as is so wonderful?" Yes, it was those letters, that interlaced old-fashioned cipher, that Z.H. that she knew of old stood for Zachary Hepburn, Philip's father. She knew how Philip valued this watch. She remembered having seen it in his hands the very day before his disappearance, when he was looking at the time in his annoyance at Sylvia's detention in her walk with baby. Hester had no doubt that he had taken this watch as a matter of course away with him. She felt sure that he would not part with this relic of his dead father on any slight necessity. Where then was Philip? By what chance of life or death had this, his valued property, found its way once more to Monkshaven? "Where did you get this?" she asked in as quiet a manner as she could assume, sick with eagerness as she was. To no one else would Darley have answered such a question. He made a mystery of most of his dealings, not that he had anything to conceal, but simply because he delighted in concealment. He took it out of her hands, looked at the number marked inside, and the maker's name, Natteau Gent, York, and then replied, "A man brought it me yesterday at nightfall, for t' sell it. It's a matter of 40 years old. Natteau Gent has been dead, and in his grave pretty nigh as long as that, but he did his work well when he were alive, and so I gave him as brought it for t' sell about as much as it were worth, the good coin. I tried him first at bartering line, but he wouldn't bite. Like enough he wanted food. Many a one does nowadays." "Who was he?" gasped Hester. "Bless woman, how should I know?" "What was he like? How old? Tell me." "My lass, I've a summat else to do wi' my eyes than go peering into men's faces at dusk light." "But you must have had light for to judge about the watch." "Eh, how sharp we are! I'd a candle close to my nose, but I didn't tak' it up for to gaze into his face. That wouldn't be manners, to my thinking." Hester was silent. Then Darley's heart relented. "If you're so set upon knowing that fellow was, I could, maybe, put you on his tracks." "How?" said Hester eagerly. "I do want to know. I want to know very much, and for a good reason." "Well, then, I'll tell you. He's a queer tyke, that one is. I'll be bound he were so pressed for t' brass. Yet he outs wi' a good half crown all wrapped up i' paper, and he axes me to make a hole in it. Says I, 'It's marring good king's coin, that after I've made a hole in it, it'll never pass current again.' So he mumbles and mumbles, but for all that it must needs be done, and he's left it here, and it's called for it to morrow at e'en." "Oh, William Darley!" said Hester, clasping her hands tight together. "Find out who he is, where he is, anything, everything about him, and I will so bless you." Darley looked at her sharply, but with some signs of sympathy on his grave face. "My woman," he said, "I could ha' wished as you'd never seen at watch. It's poor thankless work thinking too much on one o' God's creatures. But I'll do the bidding," he continued, in a lighter and different tone. "I'm a cute old badger when need be. Come for the watch in a couple o' days, and I'll tell you all as I've learnt." So Hester went away, her heart beating with the promise of knowing something about Philip. How much, how little, in these first moments, she dared not say even to herself. Some sailor newly landed from distant seas might have become possessed of Philip's watch in far off latitudes, in which case Philip would be dead. That might be. She tried to think that this was the most probable way of accounting for the watch. She could be certain as to the positive identity of the watch being in William Darley's possession. Again, it might be that Philip himself was near at hand, was here in this very place, starving as too many were, for insufficiency of means to buy the high-priced food. And then her heart burnt within her as she thought of the succulent, comfortable meals which Sylvia provided every day, nay, 3 times a day, for the household in the market-place, at the head of which Philip ought to have been. But his place knew him not. For Sylvia had inherited her mother's talent for housekeeping, and on her, in Alice's decrepitude and Hester's other occupations in the shop, devolved the cares of due provision for the somewhat heterogeneous family. And Sylvia! Hester groaned in heart over the remembrance of Sylvia's words. "I can niver forgive him the wrong he did to me." That night when Hester had come and clung to her, making the sad, shameful confession of her unreturned love. What could ever bring these two together again? Could Hester herself, ignorant of the strange mystery of Sylvia's heart, as those who are guided solely by obedience to principle must ever be of the clue to the actions of those who are led by the passionate ebb and flow of impulse? Could Hester herself? Oh! how should she speak? How should she act if Philip were near? If Philip were sad and in miserable estate? Her own misery at this contemplation of the case was too great to bear, and she sought her usual refuge in the thought of some text, some promise of Scripture, which should strengthen her faith. "With God all things are possible," said she, repeating the words as though to lull her anxiety to rest. Yes, with God all things are possible, but oft-times he does his work with awful instruments. There is a peacemaker, whose name is Death. End of chapter 44.
Chapter 45 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Velwest. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 45, Saved and Lost. Hester went out the evening of the day after that on which the unknown owner of the half-crown had appointed to call for it again at William Darley's. She had schooled herself to believe that time and patience would serve her best. Her plan was to obtain all the knowledge about Philip that she could in the first instance, and then, if circumstances allowed it, as in all probability they would, to let drop by drop of healing, peacemaking words and thoughts fall on Sylvia's obdurate, unforgiving heart. So Hester put on her things and went out down towards the old quay side on that evening after the shop was closed. Poor little Sylvia! She was unforgiving, but not obdurate to the full extent of what Hester believed. Many a time since Philip went away had she unconsciously missed his protecting love. When folks spoke shortly to her, when Alice scolded her as one of the non-elect, when Hester's gentle gravity had something of severity in it, when her own heart failed her as to whether her mother would have judged that she had done well, could that mother have known at all, as possibly she did by this time. Philip had never spoken otherwise than tenderly to her during the 18 months of their married life, except on the 2 occasions before recorded, once when she referred to her dream of Kinraid's possible return, and once again on the evening of the day before her discovery of his concealment of the secret of Kinraid's involuntary disappearance. After she had learnt that Kinraid was married, her heart had still more strongly turned to Philip. She thought that he had judged rightly in what he had given as the excuse for his double dealing. She was even more indignant at Kinraid's fickleness than she had any reason to be, and she began to learn the value of such endearing love as Philip's had been, lasting ever since the days when she first began to fancy what a man's love for a woman should be. when she had first shrunk from the tone of tenderness he put into his especial term for her, a girl of 12, little lassie, as he was wont to call her. But across all this relenting came the shadow of her vow, like a chill of a great cloud passing over a sunny plain. How should she decide? What would be her duty if he came again, and once more called her wife? She shrank from the possibility with all the weakness and superstition of her nature, and this it was which made her strengthen herself with the re-utterance of unforgiving words, and shun all recurrence to the subject on the rare occasion when Hester had tried to bring it back, with the hope of softening her heart, which to her had appeared altogether hardened on this one point. Now, on this bright summer evening, while Hester had gone down to the quayside, Sylvia stood with her out-of-door things on the parlour, rather impatiently watching the sky, full of hurrying clouds, and flushing with the warm tints of the approaching sunset. She could not leave Alice. The old woman had grown so infirm that she was never left by her daughter and Sylvia at the same time, yet Sylvia had to fetch her little girl from the new town, where she had been to her supper at Jeremiah Foster's. Hester had said that she should not be away more than a quarter of an hour. Hester was generally so punctual that any failure of hers in this respect appeared almost in the light of an injury to those who had learnt to rely upon her. Sylvia wanted to go and see the widow Dobson, and learn when Hester might be expected home. His 2 months were long past, and Sylvia had heard through the Fosters of some suitable and profitable employment for him, of which she thought he would be glad to know as soon as possible. It was now some time since she had been able to get so far as across the bridge, and for aught she knew, Kester might already be come back from his expedition to the Cheviots. Kester was come back. Scarce 5 minutes had elapsed after those thoughts had passed through her mind, before his hasty hand lifted the latch of the kitchen door. His hurried steps brought him face to face with her. The smile of greeting was arrested on her lips by one look at him, his eyes staring wide, the expression on his face wild and yet pitiful. "That's reet," said he, seeing that her things were already on. "Thou're wanted sore. Come along." "Oh, dear God! My child!" cried Sylvia, clutching at the chair near her, but recovering her eddying senses with the strong fact before her that whatever the terror was, she was needed to combat it. "Ay, thy child," said Kester, taking her almost roughly by the arm, and drawing her away with him out through the open doors on to the quay side. "Tell me," said Sylvia, faintly, "is she dead?" "She's safe enow," said Kester. "It's not her, it's him as saved her as needs you, if iver a husband needed a wife." "He? Who? Oh, Philip! Philip, is it yo at last?" Unheeding what spectators might see her movements, she threw up her arms, and staggered against the parapet of the bridge they were then crossing. "He, Philip, saved Bella? Bella, our little Bella, as got her dinner by my side, and went out with Jeremiah as well as could be? I cannot take it in. Tell me, Kester." She kept trembling so much in voice and in body that he saw she could not stir without danger of falling until she was calmed. As it was, her eyes became filmy from time to time, and she drew her breath in great heavy pants, leaning all the while against the wall of the bridge. "It were no illness," Kester began. "The little one had gone for a walk wi' Jeremiah Foster, and he were drawn for to go round to the edge o' the cliff where they's making t' new walk reet over t' sea. But they's bit but on a pathway now, and t' one was too old and the other too young for to see the water coming along with great leaps. It always for coming up high again the cliff, and this springtide it coming in terrible big waves. Some one said as they passed a man a sitting on a bit o' rock up above. I don't know. I only know as I heard the great fearful screech i' the air. I were just a resting after I'd come in not half an hour at the place. I've walked better nor a dozen mile to day, and I ran out and I looked, and just on the walk at the turn was the swish of a wave running back as quick as the mischief into the sea, and old Jeremiah standing like one crazy, looking out over into water, and like a stroke of lightning comes a man, and in it the very mist o' the great waves like a shot, and then I knowed something were in the water as were nearer death than life, and it seemed to misdoubt me as that were our Bella, and I shouts and I cries for help, and I goes myself to the very edge o' the cliff, and I bids out Jeremiah, as was like one beside hisself, who would died on me, for he were good for nothing else, and I bides my time, and when I sees 2 arms a holding out a little dripping streaming child, I clutches her by her waistband and hauls her to land. She's noane t' worse for her bath, I'll be bound.' 'I mun go let me,' said Sylvia, struggling with his detaining hand, which he had laid upon her in the fear that she would slip down to the ground in a faint, so ashen gray was her face. 'Let me, Bella, I mun go to her.' He let go, and she stood still, suddenly feeling herself too weak to stir. 'Now, if you'll try a bit to be quiet, I'll lead you along. But yo mun be steady and brave, lass.' 'A lot, if you only let me see Bella,' said Sylvia, humbly. 'And you niver asked after him as saved her,' said Kester, reproachfully. 'I know it's Philip,' she whispered. 'And you said he wanted me, so I know he's safe. And, Kester, I think I'm feared on him, and I'd like to gather courage afore seeing him, and a look at Bella would give me courage. It were terrible time when I saw him last, and I did say ' 'Never think on what thou did say. Think on what thou will say to him now, for he lies a dying. He were dashed against t' cliff and bruised sore on his innards afore t' men as come wi' the boat could pick him up.' She did not speak. She did not even tremble now. She set her teeth together, and holding tight to Kester, she urged him on, but when they came to the end of the bridge she seemed uncertain which way to turn. 'This way,' said Kester. 'He's been lodging wi' Sally this 9 week, and niver a one about the place that knowed him. He'd been at t' wars and getten his face brunt.' 'And he was short o' food,' moaned Sylvia, 'and we had plenty. And I tried to make yo'r sister turn him out and send him away. Oh, will God iver forgive me?' Muttering to herself, breaking her mutterings with sharp cries of pain, Sylvia, with Kester's help, reached Widow Dobson's house. It was no longer a quiet, lonely dwelling. Several sailors stood about the door, awaiting in silent anxiety for the verdict of the doctor, who was even now examining Philip's injuries. 2 or 3 women stood talking eagerly, in low voices, in the doorway. But when Sylvia drew near, the men fell back, and the women moved aside as though to allow her to pass, all looking upon her with a certain amount of sympathy, but perhaps with rather more of antagonistic wonder as to how she was taking it. She, who had been living in ease and comfort, while her husband's shelter was little better than a hovel, her husband's daily life a struggle with starvation, for so much of the lodger at Widow Dobson's was popularly known, and any distrust of him as a stranger and a tramp was quite forgotten now. Sylvia felt the hardness of their looks, the hardness of their silence, but it was as nothing to her. If such things could have touched her at this moment, she would not have stood still right in the midst of their averted hearts, and murmured something to Kester. He could not hear the words uttered by that hoarse, choked voice, until he had stooped down and brought his ear to the level of her mouth. 'We'd better wait for the doctor to come out,' she said again. She stood by the door, shivering all over, almost facing the people in the row, but with her face turned a little to the right, so that they thought she was looking at the pathway on the cliff side, 100 yards or so distant, below which the hungry waves still lashed themselves into high ascending spray, while nearer to the cottage, where their force was broken by the bar at the entrance to the river, they came softly lapping up the shelving shore. Sylvia saw none of all this, though it was straight before her eyes. She only saw a blurred mist. She heard no sound of waters, though it filled the ears of those around. Instead, she heard low whispers pronouncing Philip's earthly doom. For the doctors were both agreed his internal injury was of a mortal kind, although as the spine was severely injured above the seat of the fatal bruise, he had no pain in the lower half of his body. They had spoken in so low a tone that John Foster, standing only a foot or so away, had not been able to hear their words, but Sylvia heard each syllable there where she stood outside, shivering all over in the sultry summer evening. She turned round to Kester. 'I mun go to him, Kester. Thou'll see that no one come in to us when the doctors come out.' She spoke in a soft, calm voice, and he, not knowing what she had heard, made some easy, conditional promise. Then those opposite to the cottage door fell back, for they could see the grave doctors coming out, and John Foster, graver, sadder still, following them. Without a word to them, without a word even of inquiry, which many outside thought and spoke of as strange, white-faced, dry-eyed Sylvia slipped into the house out of their sight, and the waves kept lapping on the shelving shore. The room inside was dark, all except a little halo or circle of light made by a dip candle. Widow Dobson had her back to the bed, her bed, onto which Philip had been borne in the hurry of terror as to whether he was alive or whether he was dead. She was crying quietly, but the tears downfalling fast, as with her back to the lowly bed, she was gathering up the dripping clothes cut off from the poor maimed body by the doctor's orders. She only shook her head as she saw Sylvia, spirit-like, steal in, white, noiseless, and upborne from earth. But noiseless as her step might be, he heard, he recognized, and with a sigh he turned his poor disfigured face to the wall, hiding it in the shadow. He knew that she was by him, that she had knelt down by his bed, that she was kissing his hand, over which the languor of approaching death was stealing. But no one spoke. At length he said, his face still averted, speaking with an effort, "Little lassie, forgive me now. I cannot live to see the morn." There was no answer, only a long, miserable sigh, and he felt her soft cheek laid upon his hand, and the quiver that ran through her whole body. "I did thee a cruel wrong," he said at length. "I see it now. But I'm a dying man. I think that God will forgive me, and I've sinned against him. Try, lassie, try, my Sylvie. Will thou not forgive me?" He listened intently for a moment. He heard through the open window the waves lapping on the shelving shore, but there came no word from her, only that same long, shivering, miserable sigh broke from her lips at length. "Child," said he, once more, "I have made thee my idol, and if I could live my life o'er again, I would love my God more and thee less. And then I shouldn't ha' sinned the sin against thee. But speak one word of love to me, one little word, that I may know I have thy pardon." "Oh, Philip, Philip!" she moaned, thus adjured. Then she lifted her head and said, "Them were wicked, wicked words as I said, and a wicked vow as I vowed, and Lord God Almighty had taken me at my word. I'm sorely punished, Philip, I am indeed." He pressed her hand, he stroked her cheek, but he asked for yet another word. "I did thee wrong. In my lying heart I forgot to do to thee as I would have had thee do to me, and I judged Kinraid in my heart." "Thou thought as he was faithless and fickle," she answered quickly, "and so he were. He were married to another woman not so many weeks at after thou went away. Oh, Philip, Philip, and now I have thee back, and—" Dying was the word she would have said, but first the dread of telling him what she believed he did not know, and next her passionate sobs choked her. "I know," said he, once more stroking her cheek and soothing her with a gentle caressing hand. "Little lassie," he said, after a while when she was quiet from very exhaustion, "I never thought to be so happy again. God is very merciful." She lifted up her head and asked wildly, "Will he ever forgive me, think you? I drove you out from your home, and I sent you away to wars where you might have gotten your death, and when you came back, poor and lone and weary, I told her for to turn you out, for I knew you must be starving in these famine times. I think I shall go about among them as gnash their teeth for ever, while you are where all the tears are wiped away." "No," said Philip, turning round his face, forgetful of himself in his desire to comfort her. "God pities us as a father pities her poor wandering children. The nearer I come to death, the clearer I see him. But you and me have done wrong to each other, yet we can see now how we were led to it. We can pity and forgive one another. I'm getting low and faint, lassie. But thou must remember this. God knows more, and is more forgiving than either you to me or me to you. I think and do believe as we shall meet together before his face. But then I shall ha' learnt to love thee second to him, not first, as I have done here upon the earth." Then he was silent, very still. Sylvia knew, Widow Dobson had brought it in, that there was some kind of medicine sent by the hopeless doctors lying upon the table hard by, and she softly rose and poured it out and dropped it into the half-open mouth. Then she knelt down again, holding the hand feebly stretched out to her, and watching the faint light in the wistful, loving eyes. And in the stillness she heard the ceaseless waves, lapping against the shelving shore. Something like an hour before this time, which was the deepest midnight of the summer's night, Hester Rose had come hurrying up the road to where Kester and his sister sate outside the open door, keeping their watch under the starlit sky, all others having gone away one by one, even John and Jeremiah Foster having returned to their own house, where the little Bella lay, sleeping a sound and healthy slumber after her perilous adventure. Hester had heard but little from William Darley as to the owner of the watch and the half-crown, but he was chagrined at the failure of all his skilful interrogations to elicit the truth, and promised her further information in a few days, with all the more vehemence because he was unaccustomed to being baffled. And Hester had again whispered to herself, "Patience, patience," and had slowly returned back to her home to find that Sylvia had left it. Why, she did not at once discover. But, growing uneasy as the advancing hours neither brought Sylvia nor little Bella to their home, she had set out for Jeremiah Foster's as soon as she had seen her mother comfortably asleep in her bed. And then she had learnt the whole story, bit by bit, as each person who spoke broke in upon the previous narration with some new particular. But from no one did she clearly learn whether Sylvia was with her husband or not. And so she came speeding along the road, breathless, to where Kester sate in a wakeful, mournful silence, his sister's sleeping head lying on his shoulder. The cottage door opened, both for air and that there might be help within call if needed, and the dim, slanting colouring of the interior light lying across the road. Hester came panting up, too agitated and breathless to ask how much was truth of the fatal, hopeless tale which she had heard. Kester looked at her without a word. Through this solemn, momentary silence the lapping of the ceaseless waves was heard, as they came up close on the shelving shore. "He, Philip?" said she. Kester shook his head sadly. "And his wife? Sylvia?" said Hester. "In there with him, alone," whispered Kester. Hester turned away and wrung her hands together. "Oh, Lord God Almighty!" said she. "Was I not even worthy to bring them together at last?" And she went away slowly and heavily back to the side of her sleeping mother. But "Thy will be done" was on her quivering lips before she lay down to her rest. The soft grey dawn lightens the darkness of a midsummer night soon after 2 o'clock. Philip watched it come, knowing that it was his last sight of day, as we reckon days on earth. He had been often near death as a soldier, once or twice, as when he rushed into fire to save Kinraid. His chances of life had been as 1 to 100, but yet he had had a chance. Now there was the new feeling, the last new feeling which we shall any of us experience in this world, that death was not only close at hand, but inevitable. He felt its numbness stealing up on him. But the head was clear, the brain more than commonly active in producing vivid impressions. It seemed but yesterday since he was a little boy at his mother's knee, wishing with all the earnestness of his childish heart to be like Abraham, who was called the friend of God, or David, who was said to be the man after God's own heart, or St. John, who was called the beloved. As very present seemed the day on which he made resolutions of trying to be like them. It was in the spring, and someone had brought cowslips, and the scent of those flowers was in his nostrils now, as he lay a-dying, his life ended, his battles fought, his time for being good over and gone, the opportunity once given in all eternity past. All the temptations that had beset him rose clearly before him. The scenes themselves stood up in their solid materialism. He could have touched the places, the people, the thoughts. The arguments that Satan had urged in behalf of sin were reproduced with the vividness of a present time. And he knew that the thoughts were illusions, the arguments false and hollow, for in that hour came the perfect vision of the perfect truth. He saw the way to escape, which had come along with the temptation. Now the strong resolve of an ardent boyhood, with all a life before it to show the world what a Christian might be. And then the swift, terrible now, when his naked, guilty soul shrank into the shadow of God's mercy seat, out of the blaze of his anger against all who act a lie. His mind was wandering, and he plucked it back. Was this death in very deed? He tried to grasp at the present, the earthly present, fading quickly away. He lay there on the bed, on Sally Dobson's bed in the house place, not on his accustomed pallet on the lean-to. He knew that much. And the door was open into the still dusk night, and through the door casement he could hear the lapping of the waves on the shelving shore, could see the grey dawn over the sea. He knew it was over the sea. He saw what lay unseen behind the poor walls of the cottage, and it was Sylvia who held his hand tight in her warm, living grasp. It was his wife whose arm was thrown around him, whose sobbing sighs shook his numbed frame from time to time. "God bless and comfort my darling," he said to himself. "She knows me now. All will be right in heaven, in the light of God's mercy." And then he tried to remember all that he had ever read about God, and all that the blessed Christ, that bringeth glad tidings of great joy unto all people, had said of the Father from whom he came. These sayings dropped like balm down upon his troubled heart and brain. He remembered his mother, and how she had loved him, and he was going to a love wiser, tenderer, and deeper than hers. As he thought this, he moved his hands as if to pray, but Sylvia clenched her hold, and he lay still, praying all the same for her, for his child, and for himself. Then he saw the sky redden with the first flush of dawn. He heard Kester's long-drawn sigh of weariness outside the open door. He had seen Widow Dobson pass through long before to keep the remainder of her watch on the bed in the lean-to, which had been his for many and many a sleepless and tearful night. Those nights were over. He should never see that poor chamber again, though it was scarce 2 feet distant. He began to lose all sense of the comparative duration of time. It seemed as long since the kind Sally Dobson had bent over him with a soft, lingering look before going into the humble sleeping-room, as long as it was since his boyhood, when he stood by his mother dreaming of the life that should be his, with the scent of the cowslips tempting him to be off to the woodlands where they grew. Then there came a rush and an eddying through his brain, his soul trying her wings for the long flight. Again he was in the present. He heard the waves lapping against the shelving shore once again. And now his thoughts came back to Sylvia. Once more he spoke aloud in a strange and terrible voice which was not his. Every second came with efforts that were new to him. "My wife, Sylvie, once more, forgive me all." She sprang up. She kissed his poor burnt lips. She held him in her arms. She moaned and said, "Oh, wicked me! Forgive me, Philip!" Then he spoke and said, "Lord, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive each other." And after that the power of speech was conquered by the coming death. He lay very still, his consciousness fast fading away, yet coming back in throbs, so that he knew it was Sylvia who touched his lips with cordial, and that it was Sylvia who murmured words of love in his ear. He seemed to sleep at last, and so he did, a kind of sleep. But the light of the red morning sun fell on his eyes, and with one strong effort he rose up and turned so as once more to see his wife's pale face of misery. "In heaven," he cried, and a bright smile came on his face as he fell back on his pillow. Not long after Hester came, the little Bella scarce awake in her arms, with the purpose of bringing his child to see him ere yet he passed away. Hester had watched and prayed through the livelong night, and now she found him dead, and Sylvia, tearless and almost unconscious, lying by him, her hand holding his, her other thrown around him. Kester, poor old man, was sobbing bitterly, but she not at all. Then Hester bore her child to her, and Sylvia opened wide her miserable eyes, and only stared, as if all sense was gone from her. But Bella, suddenly rousing up at the sight of the poor, scarred, peaceful face, cried out, "Poor man! Who was so hungry? Is he not hungry now?" "No," said Hester softly. "The former things are passed away, and he is gone where there is no more sorrow, and no more pain." But then she broke down into weeping and crying. Sylvia sat up and looked at her. "Why do you cry, Hester?" she said. "You never said you wouldn't forgive him as long as you lived. You never broke the heart of him that loved you, and let him almost starve at your very door. Oh, Philip, my Philip, tender and true!" Then Hester came round and closed the sad, half-opened eyes, kissing the calm brow with a long farewell kiss. As she did so, Her eyes fell on a black ribbon round his neck. She partly lifted it out. To it was hung a half-crown piece. "This is the piece he left at William Darley's to be bored," said she, "not many days ago." Bella had crept to her mother's arms, as a known haven in this strange place, and the touch of his child loosened the fountains of her tears. She stretched out her hand for the black ribbon, put it round her own neck, and after a while she said, "Live very long, and try very hard to be good all that time, do you think, Hester? As God will let me to him where he is." Monkshaven is altered now into a rising bathing place, yet standing near the site of Widow Dobson's house on a summer's night, at the ebb of a spring tide, you may hear the waves come lapping up the shelving shore, with the same ceaseless, ever recurrent sound as that which Philip listened to on the pauses between life and death. And so it will be until there shall be no more sea. But the memory of man fades away. A few old people can still tell you the tradition of the man who died in the cottage somewhere about this spot, died of starvation while his wife lived in hard-hearted plenty not 2 good stone throws away. This is the form into which popular feeling and ignorance of the real facts have moulded the story. Not long since, a lady went to the public baths, a handsome stone building erected on the very site of Widow Dobson's cottage, and finding all the rooms engaged, she sat down and had some talk with the bathing woman, and, as it chanced, the conversation fell upon Philip Hepburn and the legend of his fate. "I knew an old man when I was a girl," said the bathing woman, "as could never abide to hear t' wife blamed. He would say nothing against the husband. He used to say as it were not fit for men to be judging, that she had her sore trial as well as Hepburn hisself." The lady asked, "What became of the wife?" "She was a pale, sad woman, always dressed in black. I can just remember her when I was a little child, but she died before her daughter was well grown up, and Miss Rose took t' lassie, as had always been like her own." "Miss Rose?" "Hester Rose. Ha' you never heard o' Hester Rose, as she founded t' almshouses for poor disabled sailors and soldiers on t' Horncastle road? There's a piece o' stone in front to say that 'this building is erected in the memory of P.H.' and some folk will have it P.H. stands for t' name o' t' man as was starved to death." "And the daughter?" "One of the Fosters, them as founded t' old bank, left her a vast o' money, and she were married to a distant cousin of theirs, and went off to settle in America, many and many a year ago." End of chapter 45. Recording by Linda Velwest. End of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell.